all 57 people had safely boarded the evacuation ship off the island and expressed hope for Yennekar's swift return. Meanwhile, Ed gasped for breath as he ran across the campus, deciding to postpone dealing with the captured Elte until later. Ed trusted that the Elte company would monitor Elte Cahelland, and Lortel would handle everything necessary, since she was the one connected to him. Ed panted from exhaustion, telling himself that sprinting at full speed to the highest point of the island had made his body feel heavy. He had reached Trix Hall, the place he called the starting point of this story arc. This was where Professor Glast had stolen the sage's sealed tome, and also where Taylor began his journey. Ed climbed the stairs, passing medical staff tending to the injured, and he never thought he would return here. But ultimately, his reverse journey had brought him back to the starting point. He thought that this was where Taylor began, and also where he would end his own journey. And there, Lucy was standing alone, quietly looking out at the glowing spires under the moonlight. Ed walked forward, reflecting on the legacy of Archmage Glocht, who had used his fortune to establish scholarships and construct buildings for the academy. Glocht's presence was everywhere, and Ed knew it well. Therefore, finding Lucy was not difficult. He knew for certain she would be here. He found her at the spot overlooking the entire academy. Because for Lucy, Sylvania Academy was a memento left behind by Glocht. Ed approached, breaking the silence with a greeting, and Lucy replied. He asked if she still had any jerky, but the answer was still no, disappointing Ed because their conversations always repeated this pattern. Lucy asked what he was doing here, and Ed replied that he was reminiscing. Ed nervously looked down at the deadly height, while Lucy began to say that she once had a very sad memory, but now she no longer felt distressed. Ed curiously asked why. Lucy explained that there was no specific reason. She simply concluded that it was because too much time had passed. Lucy recalled the serene image of Archmage Glocht, explaining that attempting to resurrect him after all this time was foolish, as he had been ready for his death. Ed mused that using forbidden magic to revive a legendary Archmage, who had dedicated his life to magical research, would be a great insult. He admitted that he had known from the start that attempting to revive him was a selfish act. Lucy looked up, her face hidden in the shadow of her hood, and spoke softly. Ed anxiously checked on Lucy, even though he told himself he had no right to speak after trying to stop her. He couldn't help but ask, fearing that Lucy might change her mind at any moment and cause a terrible catastrophe. Determined to confirm her intentions, Ed called out to her. He sighed, secretly guessing that she was about to ask for dried jerky again. Unexpectedly, Lucy leaned her head on Ed's shoulder and gently asked to borrow it. Ed was surprised, finally understanding why she had signaled him to sit down next to her. At the same moment, a massive surge of magical energy erupted from the top of one of the mage towers. Ed recalled the fanatical image of Professor Glast, realizing that no one could be more devoted to celestial magic than him, and that the resurrection spell would never be cast again. He reflected on loss, noting that everyone must experience it, and the important thing was learning to accept it, even as tears began to fall onto Lucy's cloak. Ed realized that Lucy, more than anyone, understood this, as she quietly wept on his shoulder. Ed's eyes shone with deep understanding and empathy. And then, in that moment of silence, they sat there for a long time, gazing at the mage towers piercing the night sky, a starry expanse that seemed further away than ever. The sight of magical light trails interwoven against the deep purple night sky was strangely beautiful. Suddenly, the ground shook as a golden guardian emerged from the magic circle, rising to protect the sacrifice. Taylor and his team gasped, exhausted in the middle of the magical battlefield. Suddenly, Ayla was seized by a beam of light, causing Taylor to scream her name in horror. Professor Glast revealed himself as the mastermind, unleashing a massive source of dark energy. With eyes blazing with magic, Glast smiled maliciously as he completed his ritual. Taylor could only look up in terror as a gigantic figure rushed past. The Golden Guardian delivered a devastating punch, and the truth was revealed. Ayla had been sealed within its core. A fierce energy explosion spread, leaving behind shards of magic. In the midst of the danger, Ziggs braced himself, using his body to block the golem's colossal fist. He roared, urging Taylor to seize the golden opportunity. Without a moment's hesitation, Taylor leaped off Ziggs' back, charging straight toward the enemy. He poured all his strength into running up the giant's arm, determined to free Ayla. Simultaneously, Professor Glast's inner monologue echoed, admitting that he had been short-sighted. While Taylor screamed for Ayla's release, Glast's monologue began, recalling a time in the past. He remembered the moment his eyesight deteriorated to the point where he couldn't see clearly without glasses. That was when the life of a professor began. Glast immersed himself in the quiet life of the laboratory, diligently copying a sealed tome belonging to the sage. His desk was piled high with books, the result of long days analyzing celestial magic and drafting curricula. Then, at one point, a silent change occurred. The view outside his laboratory window had changed, signaling the passage of time and an impending turning point. Professor Glast recalled a snowy day when a persistent first-year student from the elemental faculty came to see him. The lavender-haired student expressed her desire to study intermediate magic ahead of the curriculum. Then the season changed, the snow melted, and the rains began to fall outside his office window. He quietly contemplated during the dreary, rainy days. The young assistant professor, Cleo, was constantly causing trouble and then nervously apologizing profusely. Following that came the beautiful sunny days, when a gentle breeze carried flower petals past the window frame. He found peace in his work, quietly reading at his desk. A high-ranking official, who would later become Principal Obel, always made a habit of stopping by to enjoy a cup of tea, a custom that never changed. Glast once believed that if he just buried himself in that familiar routine, the painful memories hidden within a tightly locked book would vanish. But closing it only unleashed a terrifying source of energy. He coughed up blood while attempting to control the forbidden magic emanating from the hovering book, which radiated immense power. Memories of the confrontation to seize the magical artifact flooded back, recalling how he was thrown back by its very power. He had tried using celestial magic to reverse time on a small scale, but the attempt shattered. Despite being severely injured, Glast frantically tried to mend what was lost. But the sorrowful memories never faded. Instead, they crystallized into a burning gaze of hatred. Returning to the present, that chaotic energy erupted from the Golden Guardian, creating a magical tremor that engulfed the battlefield. Witnessing that unimaginable destructive power, Ziggs, Elvira, and Penia could only scream in utter terror. Celestial magic exploded, unleashing a destructive wave of energy from the Golden Guardian. Amidst the chaos, Ed Rothstaler quickly cast the multiple-time prison, freezing Yennecar, Lortel, and the other allies. His eyes glowed with intense focus, maintaining the fragile protective barrier. Meanwhile, Ayla screamed, using all her strength to push Taeli away from the deadly energy stream. Stunned for a moment, Taeli gritted his teeth, his fierce determination surging. He raised his blood-soaked sword high, ready to charge into the eye of the storm. Professor Glast, despite his severe injuries, wore a satisfied smile as his plan was about to materialize. In that moment, his mind began to drift. His vision gradually blurred as his strength waned. Piercing the darkness, the image of his lost daughter, Miuri, appeared, serving as his final source of motivation. That's right. It's almost there, Glast muttered to himself, determined to achieve his goal. He reached out, grasping the energy core of the trembling reality. Suddenly, Clevius Nortondale emerged from the shadows, panting heavily but with sharp eyes. "Don't stand in my way," Glast roared, attempting to complete the reality reversal ritual. The energy core of the Guardian Giant flared, reaching its peak power. But a decisive slash cut deep into that glowing core. A terrifying explosion erupted as the giant shattered from within. The shockwave flung Professor Glast away, his face contorted in astonishment and despair. In his eyes, only the reflection of his utterly collapsed plan remained. Amidst the sea of flames, Taeli unleashed a swordmaster's ultimate skill. His empowered blade struck directly into the Guardian Giant's core, inflicting fatal cracks. In a moment of desperation, a forbidden spell was activated, attempting to reverse the flow of time. Its power spread, affecting even the students who were frozen in space. Professor Glast gritted his teeth, determined to sacrifice his remaining life for this futile endeavor. But his body could not withstand the pressure, and fresh blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. With his last ounce of strength, Glast launched an ice spear as a desperate attack. Unexpectedly, a mysterious dark-haired mage appeared and signaled his comrades. His entire group simultaneously cast a complex incantation, neutralizing Glast's magic. Glast stared at them in shock, whispering resignedly as he realized his fate. A flash of light flickered in his eyes, reflecting total collapse. Immediately afterward, the Guardian Giant exploded in a massive fireball. The magic backfired, and Professor Glast's body began to disintegrate into dust. Taeli, utterly drained after the attack, collapsed onto the ground amidst the explosion's aftermath. The entire battlefield was enveloped in a thick curtain of smoke and dust. Through the smoke, a figure slowly stepped forward. The figure's heavy breathing echoed, breaking the post-battle silence. Lying faintly on the ground, Professor Glast looked up at the victor and conceded defeat. The mysterious mage coldly used his foot to push Glast's disintegrating body aside. Professor Glast's body tumbled down from the peak of the brightly glowing magic tower against the night sky. He plummeted straight down, a solitary dark silhouette falling from the magnificent structure that radiated chaotic energy. In his death throes, Glast's face was smeared with blood, his shattered glasses reflecting the magical light one last time. With his fading breath, he whispered a deep longing. Miuri. As Glast fell, a complex magic circle suddenly manifested directly beneath him. It erupted in a blinding flash of light, engulfing his free-falling body. In a magical burst, he vanished from the air. He then reappeared beneath an ancient tree in the tranquil forest. The spatial teleportation magic had succeeded. However, Glast staggered, blood continuously pouring from his fatal wound. Even his magical power could no longer sustain him. Exhausted, he collapsed by the tree, knowing this was his end. Just then, Glast looked up, startled to see someone standing before him, and wondered how they could be there after curfew. That person was Ed Rothstaler, standing silently with an undisclosed purpose. 1 hour earlier, the peak of the Trix Hall Tower had exploded in a fierce storm of magical power. Meanwhile, Lortel was moving quickly, inwardly thinking that all risk factors had been properly handled. She decided to check on Ed, who had suddenly rushed to Trix Hall, before heading to her rendezvous point. Upon arrival, Lortel saw Ed waving at her, standing next to a student wearing a witch's hat. Suddenly, the student in the witch's hat tightly gripped Ed's arm. Ed turned back with a confused expression, while Lortel immediately sensed an imminent danger. Ed observed Dorothy, an elite third-year student, and assistant Professor Cleo. Noting that the situation in the underground waterways seemed to have been resolved, he was momentarily confused to see Dorothy sobbing uncontrollably. When Ed turned back, both women shrieked in surprise at his sudden appearance. Meanwhile, Yennecar collapsed to her knees, a phantom image of the colossal spirit Takan appearing as she desperately called Ed's name. Regaining her composure, Yennecar seriously told Ed that she needed to confirm something about the tower's celestial magic. She explained that her meetings with her spirits were actually meant to protect the northern forest, although recently the topic had revolved solely around Ed's life. A few days prior, Takan sensed a type of magic similar to that of the towers in the forest, leading Yennecar to believe only one person could be behind it. She wondered what Professor Glast had been doing in the forest, as no actual towers had appeared. Hearing this, Ed initially decided he didn't need to investigate further since this event was not in the game's original plot. But then he recalled the battle where he was nearly wiped out by Elta, and realized that if Glast also deviated from the script, the consequences would be unpredictable. Driven by this fear, Ed decided he had to go check on the professor's situation. He ventured alone into the dark forest under the cover of night. There, he found Professor Glast, leaning against a tree and dying, who was surprised and asked why Ed was out after curfew. Just then, Lortel and Yennecar arrived, utterly astonished to find Ed with Glast. Coughing up blood, Glast replied that he was gazing at the moon, then wondered if that was ridiculous. Ed affirmed it was not, but Glast mocked himself, saying he found his own situation absurd. Glast conceded that Ed was right, that his failure was inevitable, though he never expected to be thwarted by a group of students. He believed that even if he had won, Principal Abel would have intervened, perhaps only hesitating due to their friendship. After Glast admitted Ed was a more exceptional student than he had thought, Ed immediately asked why the professor had kidnapped him in the first place. Glast confessed he originally intended to recruit Ed for his talent, but the plan fell apart when Ed collapsed from exhaustion. He recalled that when he came to check on them after the kidnapping, Ed had escaped with Isla. Accepting his fate, Glast considered this solitary death too light a price for his sins. Nevertheless, he asserted that he had never felt lonely during the 17 years he spent with his daughter. In a fleeting memory of Muri, Glast confirmed to Ed that those 17 years had passed too quickly. Ed sat down and unexpectedly asked Glast about his relationship with assistant Professor Cleo. He pointed out a strange coincidence. Counting her time as his student and assistant, Glast had also known Cleo for 17 years. Ed revealed that he had just met Cleo on his way here, and she was crying. Ed recalled Cleo saying that Professor Glast was a person one couldn't help but hate. She listed his many flaws: stubborn, abrasive, self-righteous, and the only person who had ever criticized her. But, after a moment of choking back tears, Cleo tearfully admitted that, despite everything, Glast was the most brilliant scholar she had ever met, leading Ed to believe she had sensed his fate. Ed also remembered Dorothy, who had tremblingly expressed eternal gratitude for Glast, recognizing her talent. Ed mused that there was no denying Glast had gone astray by taking students hostage. He was wrong to lament dying alone in solitude, because the truth was, Cleo, who became an assistant professor at a very young age, and Dorothy, the top student in alchemy, had both once been considered talentless. Although he constantly criticized the untalented, Glast was the one who tirelessly sought out and nurtured his students' hidden potential. Ed reflected that it seemed Glast had been determined to prove that even his daughter was a person of value. The professor had been a teacher and colleague to too many people to die in solitude. Ed realized Professor Glast was severely nearsighted, and at some point, He couldn't see anything without his glasses. He couldn't even clearly see himself anymore. Professor Glass lay silent, seemingly accepting his fate. Then he spoke, revealing that he had known the state of the Soul Library before using the summoning magic. He admitted Ed had cleaned out the library well, only taking the most valuable production formulas, but called it a meaningless effort, making Ed wonder if there was something more. With an enigmatic remark, Glass produced a gleaming silver key. He placed the key in Ed's hand, saying that Ed would have to clean up the rest himself. Professor Glass declared that from now on, the Soul Library belonged to Ed. Shocked, Ed asked why, but Glass merely countered with a question, asking if Ed was complaining. Glass instructed Ed to find a secret safe guarded by Reyna, and warned him to ensure the Academy staff didn't discover it. With his final breath, he whispered one last name: Lucy. Glass's words reminded Ed of the people around him, and the importance of observing them closely. A flash of realization sparked in the dying professor's eyes. He murmured his final words, saying it was a wise decision, and slowly closed his eyes. As Glass took his last breath, Ed wondered what expression Lucy must have had at that exact moment. He regretted not being able to witness it, his hand unconsciously clutching the hem of his cloak. Left only with the peaceful face of the deceased, Ed could only surmise the truth based on what had just transpired. Professor Glass had passed away, his body leaning against the tree under the moonlight, appearing to be in eternal slumber. Ed, Lortel, and Yennecar stood silently for a long time, witnessing that quiet moment together. Afterward, in the principal's office, Ed faced an interrogation, as Principal Abel listed his presence in every major incident, from the occupation of the Ophelis building to the theft of the sealed tome. The principal addressed him directly as Ed Rostaler, making Ed inwardly groan about having to repeat his story all night long. Abel questioned Ed's testimony, doubting the story that he was kidnapped, escaped on his own, and then coincidentally met Taylor's group. Ed patiently insisted that every detail was in the report, but Abel immediately focused on the crucial point: why Ed left Isla behind during his escape. In a brief memory, Ed recalled the moment Ayla was unable to move and completely distrusted him. Just as he was about to explain that he had to go seek aid, Abel decisively cut him off. The principal bluntly expressed his suspicion, and Ed himself realized his story contained too many unbelievable coincidences. Abel pointed out that Ed's strangely calm demeanor, despite always acting as a detached observer, only made him more suspicious. Then, with a sudden slam of his hand on the table, Abel's tone abruptly shifted. He declared that in both incidents, Ed had been a victim due to the Academy's negligence. Ed was stunned, realizing that what the principal was reading was not his own statement. To Ed's astonishment, Abel flipped to his academic record and acknowledged the immense effort he had put in. Utterly bewildered, Ed could only stand there as the principal announced that the Academy wished to reward him for his contributions. As Ed stepped out of the office in a daze, Yennecar was waiting and called out to him joyfully. She hurriedly inquired, expressing deep concern for his safety, but he quickly reassured her that he was perfectly fine. Suddenly, the wind spirit Dries, perched on Yennecar's shoulder, whispered something into her ear. Immediately, Yennecar's demeanor changed. She feigned pain and claimed she might have been injured while saving Ed, leaving him utterly astonished and worried. Ed frantically asked where she was hurt, and she hesitantly replied that she might have sprained her back. With a serious expression, Ed stated that the recent events had made him realize something important. He recalled all the times Yennecar had been there to help him, blaming himself for taking her presence for granted, which had now led to her suffering harm. A shadow of regret enveloped Ed as he remembered the lesson from Professor Glass's final moments. It would be too late to mourn once something was truly lost. Feeling guilty for always being a burden, Ed made Yennecar break out in a cold sweat as she realized his misunderstanding was spiraling out of control. Ed bowed deeply in apology and asked Yennecar to stop getting involved with him, causing her to panic and hastily confess that she had lied and was not injured at all. After a moment of silence, Ed looked up and unexpectedly asked Yennecar if she lived in Dex Hall. He hinted that starting next semester, he might be. Yennecar's eyes lit up, brimming with hope and anticipation. Overjoyed, she loudly asked if Ed was planning to move to Dex Hall, her enthusiastic reaction leaving him momentarily taken aback. After all the turmoil, the Academy skies finally returned to a clear, peaceful blue. Standing amidst nature, Ed sighed in relief, thinking that Act 2 of the story had concluded smoothly. He recalled Principal Abel's words, that he deserved to end his miserable life and become a normal student. With the principal's permission for him to move into the dormitory, Ed returned to his wooden shack. Looking at the prepared firewood logs, Ed felt a fleeting sense of regret, having once looked forward to building a fence, growing vegetables, and improving the place. As his shadow stretched across the door, He accepted that his reclusive life in the woods was about to end. Ed muttered a farewell to his forest life and opened the door to step inside. Instantly, a terrifying crash echoed as his roof was pierced by a strange object. Stunned by the scene of devastation, Ed was astonished to realize that Lucy Mayriel was lying unconscious on the floor. Amidst the gloomy mountain scenery, a voice remarked that it looked like rain was coming. Lucy, in the form of a child, realized she was in the northern Lamolin Mountains, not Akin Island. She wondered why she was suddenly dreaming of her childhood. Nevertheless, she decided to head toward a small stone house to visit the old man. Inside, Archmage Glocht sat silently on a chair, his back to her in the warm light. Lucy looked up at him with a pensive expression. The scene abruptly changed. The room became dark and covered in cobwebs, transforming the old man's silhouette into a ghostly shadow. Glocht's dark shadow appeared menacingly. It morphed into a skeleton with blazing red eyes, screaming and demanding why Lucy hadn't resurrected him. She realized this was a nightmare. Lucy closed her eyes, silently confronting the horror in her mind. She opened her eyes, returning to her current form. A dark-haired maid greeted her good morning and urged her to prepare for school. Lucy sat on the bed, remaining silent. In a flash of memory, she was using high-level spatial magic. A massive surge of magical energy shot into the sky, and she felt an inexplicable urge to go to the northern forest immediately. Her bare feet gently landed on the tiled roof of a house. From the rooftop, she saw Ed walking toward her. An inexplicable sense of relief spread through her as she smiled. Lucy looked up at the sky and muttered that it looked like rain was coming. Seeing her, Ed concluded that his life in the forest was likely coming to an end. A thud echoed as Lucy fell to the ground. Ed looked at the unconscious girl, thinking to himself that cats were truly incomprehensible and never did what others wanted. He continued to muse on their nature. When you want to pet them, they act aloof, but when you are busy ignoring them, they suddenly seek attention. Ed concluded that this was the nature of cats, and the best strategy to control them was simply to ignore them. Then he turned his back and walked toward his log cabin. In a classroom, Professor Fluben advised the students that if they wanted a feline familiar, they should try ignoring it, and they would be surprised when it sought them out on its own. Two female students sitting nearby giggled, suggesting that this was more complicated than dating. In the monster studies class, Ed noted that Professor Fluben was highly charismatic, which made his class consistently popular and achieving high grades difficult. But now, Ed had caught up with the lectures and was confident that no one took notes as detailed as his. So he closed his notebook as the class ended. Professor Fluben unexpectedly called Ed over and invited him to his laboratory, which surprised Ed. The professor asked Ed if he had heard about the Academy's scholarship system. Ed replied that it was a tuition support system in exchange for contributing to the Academy, while a snake slithered across Professor Fluben's arm, who confirmed that this was a good opportunity for him. When Ed asked about the specific duties, Professor Fluben explained that they were administrative tasks, but mainly assisting Assistant Professor Cleo, who was overwhelmed with the work left behind by the late Professor Glast. The professor added that Anise was helping, but Cleo still needed more assistance because there was a lot of work remaining, such as final evaluations and placement exams. Professor Fluben instructed Ed not to try intimidating the new students, and Ed nodded in agreement. Ed thought about the new students, certain that the person he was looking for was among them. He envisioned a magical book capable of amplifying magical resonance power. Meanwhile, in her office, Lortel Cahaland was holding that very glowing book and pondering deeply. She wondered if selling this powerful item to Crepin was the right decision. Lortel deduced that Ed asking for such a huge favor indicated he did not want Crepin to obtain the book. Panic set in, and she reminded herself that she had bought the book for profit and that a massive sum of money was at stake. Regaining her composure, Lortel told herself she needed to be more ruthless, as her motto was never to delay business. She looked back at Ed's letter, in which he promised to do anything for her if she secured the purchase certificate. Lortel's eyes fixated on that promise, especially the words anything, and a strange emotion swelled within her. Her cheeks flushed. She smiled slyly, and decided to add one more clause to their agreement. While writing, Lortel suddenly thought of the special classes during the winter break, and wondered who would replace the deceased Professor Glast. She sighed in relief, realizing she wouldn't have to worry about the campsite anymore, and figured everyone else was also busy with the end of the semester. As she thought of Yennecar, Ed, and Lucy, Lortel's pen suddenly snapped in half under unconscious pressure. Startled, she looked down at the broken pen, a bead of anxious sweat rolling down her cheek. Sitting alone in the vast office, Lortel suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of ominous foreboding. Meanwhile, at the log cabin in the forest, Lucy spoke up, reminding Ed that he was running out of firewood. Ed turned around, surprised by her unexpected comment. Lucy, casually chewing on dried meat, reiterated that Ed himself had said there wouldn't be enough firewood for the winter. She went on to ask why he hadn't been hunting lately, causing Ed to be secretly astonished by her sudden, helpful questions. Ed admitted he had neglected the camp maintenance because he was considering moving to Dex Hall, which also meant he and Lucy would see less of each other. Just as Ed was musing that this would help stabilize the game's storyline, a cheerful voice rang out, calling his name. Yennecar ran up, waving brightly, and explained that her afternoon class was cancelled, so she came here to relax. She sat down next to Ed, saying that since he wouldn't be at the camp after the winter break, she wanted to visit as often as possible. As Yennecar expressed her regret, Lucy shot a sharp glare, thinking to herself that she actually liked this place very much too. Yennecar asserted that Ed's comfort was more important and offered to help if he decided to move to Dex Hall, making Ed wonder about the tasks he needed to complete. While Yennecar excitedly planned their meeting at the cafeteria, Ed thoughtfully looked at the key, realizing it was time to open Professor Glast's secret safe. Suddenly, Yennecar held out a carefully sealed envelope in front of him. Ed was surprised to see it was an application to transfer into Dex Hall, and Yennecar explained that submitting it early would be better. Appreciating Yennecar's thoughtfulness, Ed took the application while she offered to fill it out with him. Just as Yennecar was about to speak further, she was startled by a figure rushing toward them. Lucy suddenly burst onto the scene, her panicked expression causing Ed to call out her name in astonishment. The barefoot mage girl hurried closer to them. Ed quickly restrained Lucy, as she desperately flailed her arms, demanding that he stop. With eyes that were both furious and desperate, Lucy screamed, ordering Ed not to take the application form. Ed could only freeze at her strange reaction, and that was the day everything began. In a memory, a voice echoed, praising that all of Ed's efforts were finally paying off. The flashback showed Ed practicing fire magic under the supervision of Yennecar and the spirit mug, with her praising his astonishing rate of progress. Yennecar commented that his spirit resonance had surpassed most novice elementalists, and his mana synchronization ability was also progressing rapidly. As she spoke, she glanced over and saw Lucy glaring at them from behind a tree, prompting her to ask Ed if she had somehow offended Lucy. Ed mused that the maids at Ophelis Hall always took meticulous care of Lucy, yet today she had escaped the dormitory in her pajamas early in the morning. Returning to his solo practice, Ed felt his magical power increase as he flipped through a book. He decided it was time to begin learning intermediate magic, and a powerful surge of blue energy enveloped his body. However, his attempt failed, the spell fizzled out, and Ed collapsed onto the floor. Later, while with another female student, Ed silently watched Lucy struggling to cut a piece of steak with all her might, wondering what had caused her current state. While Yennecar attempted to apologize, Ed noticed that Lucy seemed particularly hostile toward her. Upon closer observation, however, Ed realized that Lucy's aggressive exterior actually concealed a deep fear. Returning to his room, Ed collapsed onto his bed, exhausted, lamenting that intermediate magic was much harder to learn than he had anticipated. He lifted the book from his face when he heard a call, responding wearily. Lucy, still in her pajamas, handed him a key and asked what he planned to do after she left. Ed replied that there was a place he needed to go. He thought about needing to check the furnace since the nights were getting cold, a worry he wouldn't have if he moved to Dex Hall. Ed tucked the key inside his shirt, thinking he couldn't go anywhere until he finished his errands. He suddenly called Lucy back, which made her look at him questioningly. Lucy simply stared silently at Ed with an inscrutable expression. With a determined look, Lucy suggested they go to that place together immediately, leaving Ed completely stunned. A rope was securely tied to a tree branch beneath the sunset sky. The rope tightened as it was lowered through a hole in the ceiling of a secret structure. While rappelling down, Ed questioned why Lucy had decided to follow him all the way here. Lucy floated beside him using magic, pointing out that they could use her spells to descend more easily. Ed landed safely, asserting that everything was fine. He explained that he needed to confirm whether he could enter and exit this place on his own. Looking at the scattered pile of magical equipment, Ed realized he would have to return many times to carry everything away. He placed his hand on a flat panel on the floor, kicking up a thick layer of dust. After blowing the dust away, Ed was astonished to discover a safe hidden beneath the floor. He wondered why that person had hidden the key until the very last moment, then inserted it into the glowing lock. Inside the safe, a brilliant golden light radiated outward, enveloping both Ed and Lucy. Ed couldn't believe that Professor Glast had hidden something like this here. Meanwhile, in a dark passage, Lucy encouraged a panting Ed as he clung to the rope, telling him he was almost at the top. While climbing down, Ed muttered that Lortel would surely send him the necessary magical engineering supplies soon. He chastised himself for not asking her for a ladder first, then decided to take a short break, realizing that without his physical training, he would have given up long ago. Lucy floated beside him, curiously asking about the item Ed had just found. It was a legendary magical artifact, Glast's Golden Phoenix Ring, capable of bending the flow of time to allow the user to borrow their own future magical power. Ed deduced that, theoretically, he could use high-level magic right now by borrowing power from his future self. However, the cost was that he would fall into a state of combat incapacitation for a duration corresponding to the amount of mana used. He realized that if he wanted to use the ring in combat, there was only one way. That was to use it as a last resort, a finishing blow when facing overwhelmingly powerful enemies. Aside from combat, Ed thought about forming a spirit contract, recalling Yennecar and the immense magical power that allowed her to command countless spirits. He bitterly recalled the past, when he was a novice elementalist with meager mana reserves, finding even communication with a low-level spirit incredibly difficult. Ed gripped the ring, realizing that if he could temporarily increase his mana limit, he might be able to form a contract with a high-level spirit, despite the extreme risk involved. Lucy began to doubt, thinking that if Glast had the time to create such an item, he should have been doing something else. But she quickly dismissed the thought. Ed smiled reassuringly at Lucy, saying that everything was in the past. He put the ring away and asserted that this was the library's most valuable artifact, and Professor Glast would never waste time on meaningless things. Ed recalled Glast's philosophy, that assisting someone who lacked talent was a mistake. But now, he understood that this very artifact could shatter the desperate wall of mana deficiency. Looking at the image of Professor Glast's bloody corpse, Ed finally understood. This was the reason he researched magical engineering artifacts, and hid this one until the very end. Everything Professor Glast did, in the end, was only because he wanted to create a gift for his daughter. In the quiet of the night, Lucy called out to Ed, pulling him out of his thoughts. She began telling an allegorical story about a lost button, about only realizing the value of something once it is gone. Ed replied vaguely as he safely landed. Lucy continued, saying she constantly realized the importance of things she had once taken for granted. She admitted that the real reason she came along was because she had something she needed to ask him. With a determined gaze, Lucy asked directly if Ed intended to move into the Dex dormitory. Then she earnestly asked what would happen if he didn't move. Ed was stunned, as this was an incredibly strange request coming from someone like Lucy. He silently weighed the two options, the magnificent Dex dormitory and his simple campsite. Ed told himself that moving into the dormitory would certainly make his life easier, especially with the cold winter approaching. He admitted it was true, causing Lucy to subtly pull the brim of her hat down. Suddenly, Lucy looked up at the sky and whispered that it looked like rain, but then she immediately denied it, realizing something was wrong. Ed also looked up, asserting that it wasn't the rainy season, while a strange object began to glow high above. Lucy stood silently, her eyes filled with sorrow as she gazed at the night sky. There was no certainty that what was falling from the sky was merely a dreary rain. Tiny white particles began to fall, signaling an ill omen, even though the rainy season had long passed. Amidst the strange scene, Lucy returned to the topic, breaking the silence. Ed looked away, then replied that he had been too busy to prepare enough firewood for the winter and asked for her help. Ed smiled, saying that Lucy herself had reminded him about the lack of heating wood. Hearing this, Lucy was overjoyed, rushing forward to embrace the stunned Ed. Her witch's hat fell to the ground during the sudden embrace. Ed sighed, explaining that he was already too accustomed to life at the campsite. He added that staying here after making a few improvements would actually be more beneficial. His eyes shone with determination regarding his decision. Ed leaned back, falling onto the soft layer of snow, marking the end of Act 2 and ushering in a dramatic Act 3. Lost in thought, Ed envisioned the upcoming confrontation between Princess Penia and Lortel for the Student Council presidency. He also thought of the new protagonists and antagonists who would be enrolling, including a mysterious woman with a bandaged face, and the last person still standing on the stage of the upcoming act. It was Lucy Mayriel, the final boss of Act 3, currently submerged in a torrent of dark magic. Ed silently confronted the knowledge of a volatile future. Despite knowing the countless obstacles ahead, he decided to temporarily set aside his worries. He trusted that, after everything, both of them would be safe and sound. Seeing Lucy's happy smile mixed with tears, a side of her he had never known, Ed became even more certain that they would be fine. Winter officially arrived. Ed spent the entire morning clearing the snow around his campsite. Although he had promised himself not to overwork, since his life as a scholarship student would begin tomorrow, he was determined to finish everything today. He needed to stockpile enough firewood and preserve food for the long winter. Thanks to the freezing weather, food storage went quickly, and Ed recalled his agreement with Principal Obel trading dormitory life for a scholarship, which completely resolved his tuition burden. Ed told himself that even with free time, he couldn't afford to be lazy all day, especially while Lucy was sound asleep in his bed. He had given up trying to kick Lucy out whenever she snuck in, knowing that her protective magic would keep her from getting cold. Nevertheless, as he exhaled a white cloud into the frigid air, Ed still felt that something was amiss. Stepping out of the cabin into the snow, he realized he wouldn't have this much free time anymore, and this was the perfect moment to address a few risks. Ed looked at a coin-shaped magical artifact glowing in his palm, determined to begin his plan. He clenched his fist, and the artifact in his hand erupted in a brilliant surge of energy. Ed's entire body was engulfed in a vortex of fire as he focused his mind and called out to the high-grade spirit, Marilda. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding on the snow-covered campus of Sylvania Academy. Laplace Bakery, famous for its sweets prepared by a former royal chef and its fragrant rooftop garden, was a destination for young noblewomen. The bakery's most luxurious afternoon tea set, which was always sold out and difficult to reserve, had been prepared. Yennecar smiled contentedly next to her cup of coffee, but shyly told her friend not to call this a lure used to trick her into coming. Clara, her red-haired friend, slammed the table and bluntly declared that Yennecar was crossing a dangerous line because she had fallen madly in love with Ed Rothstaler. Yennecar gasped and yelled, "How did you know?" While Clara irritably replied that she wasn't blind and had no intention of stopping her friend. Clara explained that she was initially devastated, but since Ed's reputation had improved, she decided to accept reality, recalling how cool Ed looked in class. Clara leaned close to Yennecar, rapidly asking if she had recently experienced a speechless, racing heart, or felt too flustered to look Ed directly in the eye. Yennecar blushed and admitted that now, her feelings were no longer confusion and tension, but comfort and warmth, causing Clara to yell, "That's it!" Clara warned that this feeling of comfort was the exact sign that Yennecar was heading straight for the worst dating outcome. Bad ending. Number 13. Just friends. In a fit of anger, Clara grabbed Yennecar and shouted that one-sided affection would lead nowhere. She needed to make Ed feel the same way about her. Clara continued her speech, asserting that if Yennecar kept trailing after Ed like a puppy, she would forever remain a follower and not a girlfriend, while Yennecar's spirits enthusiastically cheered her on. Clenching Yennecar's hands, Clara anxiously stated that the winter break had begun, and since Ed kept attracting other girls, they had to quickly find a solution before she went home. Anise silently acknowledged the shrewdness of Clara, who possessed deep knowledge of relationships gained from listening to the experiences of countless people. She mused that Clara, wanting to help Yennecar, had relentlessly praised Ed to everyone, from the head maid Belle Maya to other staff and students. Thanks to these efforts, Ed's reputation had significantly improved, leading everyone in the academy to now trust him. However, Anise held a different view. She did not entirely agree with Clara's strategy. She began thinking about Assistant Professor Cleo, a person so lacking in dignity that she was frequently scolded by the librarian for returning books late. Cleo's clumsiness and continuous mistakes led people to question the true competence of an assistant professor. Nevertheless, other professors acknowledged that Cleo possessed an undeniable innate talent in a certain field. Anise recalled that Cleo had been fortunate enough to be mentored by great scholars like Professor Glast and Professor Fluben, and precisely because of this fortune, Cleo, who was utterly incompetent at handling paperwork, was able to manage important tasks thanks to having an outstanding assistant. That assistant was Anise Halen, a second-year student in the magic department, who politely declined help with a smile. Anise's competence was so exceptional that even high-ranking academy officials acknowledged her as the best. The clearest proof of her talent was the perpetually tidy office of the absent-minded Professor Cleo. She placed a thick stack of personal files on the desk, the result of secretly gathering information from across the academy, like a true stalker. Only Yennecar and Clara knew Anise's true nature, a person who believed that social relationships were merely the act of wearing different masks. She had about 20 minutes before Professor Cleo returned, enough time to analyze all the information regarding Ed Rothstaler. Anise began reviewing the files, quickly skipping the useless public information about the Rothstaler family to focus on Ed's personal history. She skimmed Ed's upbringing, from being chosen as the successor at age 2 to his poor academic performance, concluding that he possessed no talent whatsoever. A flashback revealed Anise's difficult past, where her family went bankrupt and she had to fend for herself by working as a teaching assistant to earn a scholarship. Using Lortel as a role model, Anise was determined to do anything to survive, leveraging her unique talents despite her lack of understanding regarding money. She returned to the documents, re-examining Ed's position within the Empire's most powerful family. Anise deduced that Ed Rothstaler's childhood must have been suffocating and filled with imposed ideologies, despite growing up in wealth. She continued her analysis, suggesting that Ed lacked outstanding academic talent, had low self-esteem, and would likely prefer innocent, cheerful girls. Anise muttered a detailed series of analyses regarding Ed's psychology, preferences, and behavior, believing that observational ability was more important than combat prowess. Confident in her deductions, Anise smirked and decided it was time for her to practice a little. Just then, Assistant Professor Cleo cheerfully walked in, carrying Mont Blanc pastries from the Laplace shop, and invited everyone to share. Cleo was surprised to see Anise had already prepared tea, praising her thoughtfulness for anticipating that she would bring snacks. Suddenly, Cleo tripped, shattering the teacup and scattering its contents across the floor. Panicked, she secretly thought that Anise would surely scold her again for her clumsiness. However, Anise merely asked gently if Cleo was hurt, leaving her stunned. Anise softly said she was relieved Cleo was all right, radiating a warm aura. Completely dumbfounded by the unexpected reaction, Cleo could only utter Anise's name in confusion. In a different scene, Ed thanked Belle Maya for washing his uniform, mentioning that he needed to wear it during the winter break as well. Belle replied that one uniform made no difference to her workload, and furthermore, she owed him for taking care of the person she served. Belle recounted that she had recently noticed strands of blonde hair in Lucy's laundry, while an image of Ed and Lucy resting together flashed through her mind. She further explained that when washing Ed's clothes, she noticed Lucy's white hair and the scent of the laundry detergent they used, leading Ed to secretly admit that Lucy had been very clingy lately. Ed was astonished by Belle's keen observational skills, then wondered what she would do with her life if she hadn't become a maid, before Belle interrupted to ask why he still spoke so formally. Ed insisted that he preferred it that way, but Belle stated she did not, and their exchange ended with Ed maintaining his stance. Ed thought to himself that Belle was now the head maid, a high-ranking employee, and since he was no longer a noble or a student of the Ophelis dormitory, it would be strange to speak casually. He ended his train of thought, recognizing her resolve in the sharp gaze fixed upon him. Ed tried to maintain his formal attitude, citing that Belle was now the head maid with many responsibilities. Belle gently dismissed this, playfully pointing out that Ed was the one who had many people to manage. She decided not to argue further, concluding that the young lady's choices were their own business. Belle then offered to continue doing Ed's laundry and announced that the Ophelis dormitory had been completely rebuilt. Ed commented on the rapid pace of reconstruction, deducing that the academy had poured significant resources into preparing for the new students. He continued by saying that, among the new students of the Ophelis dormitory, one particular person had completed the procedures and was about to move in. Ed correctly guessed the person's identity as Tanya Rothstaler, and Belle confirmed that she thought he already knew. The blonde young man secretly sighed, anticipating an exhausting winter break due to his sister's arrival. In a different setting at the snow-covered campsite, Ziggs mentioned he would be going home for the break, leading Ed to immediately guess it was because Elka was also leaving. While intensely training his physique, Ziggs admitted he wanted to spend time with Elka, then asked about Ed's plans. Ed replied that he would stay behind to research intermediate magic, causing Ziggs to anxiously remind him not to overexert himself. Ziggs realized he couldn't sense any magical power from Ed at all, and worried that his friend was pushing himself to the limit again. He kindly placed his hand on Ed's forehead to check his temperature. Seeing that Ed had a slight fever, Ziggs grew more worried, but Ed simply replied that he had his own reasons, and would be unable to use magic for a while. Ziggs accepted the explanation without further questioning, a quality Ed secretly appreciated. Afterward, Ziggs recounted that Isla had asked about Ed. She believed there was a misunderstanding and wanted to come apologize with Taylor. He stated that he refused to disclose Ed's location, and Ed replied that he didn't need any apology. Ed asserted that he held no resentment toward Isla, prompting Ziggs to comment that this was due to indifference rather than generosity. Ed immediately changed the subject, asking Ziggs for a favor before he went home and tossing him a pouch of money as payment. Ed explained that he needed help cleaning up Professor Glast's underground library because it was too messy. Ziggs caught the pouch, insisted Ed didn't need to pay him, and curiously asked what his friend planned to do there. Ed revealed he would turn the place into a workshop, astonishing Ziggs with his packed schedule. Ziggs advised Ed not to overwork himself, while Ed secretly checked off items on his winter break plan list, preparing for his assistant duties tomorrow. In another academy building, a voice rang out, welcoming the scholarship students. Anise Halen appeared looking utterly exhausted, explaining that Assistant Professor Cleo couldn't speak because she had been awake for 44 hours preparing for the meeting. During the meeting, a senior assistant, standing with Ed, Clevius, and another student named Onyx, began distributing the tasks. The blonde assistant announced that their mission was to prepare and supervise the placement exam for the new students. He secretly thought that Cleo now had to handle the duties Professor Glast always managed, and he already knew the outcome. The senior assistant expressed surprise at Clevius's presence, then assigned him the task of retrieving supplies for the exam at the new location. Next, he requested that Onyx assist Professor Cleo in dealing with the mountain of paperwork. Finally, he called Ed Rothstaler's name, capturing the attention of Anise, who was deep in her own calculations. Anise secretly judged Ed to be a womanizer and decided to use this opportunity to work together as a test. She was confident in her plan, having spent the entire night analyzing and crafting the ideal female persona to seduce Ed. Anise approached, asking Ed to accompany her to inspect the location, secretly resolving to remove him from Yennekar's orbit. The two arrived at the Academy's northwest mountain, a land blanketed in white snow. Anise walked cautiously on the snow, warning him about dangerous areas and slippery ice patches. After moving for a while, Anise was exhausted and panting, while Ed remained completely unperturbed. She suggested they take a short break. Anise chuckled as she thanked Ed, admitting that his strength and kindness made her realize she might have misunderstood him. Anise explained that, as Yennekar's close friend, she had been worried seeing her friend associate with someone unsuitable. She confessed that she had been too cold, excusing her actions as stemming from concern for her friend. Ed dismissed her indifferently, saying he didn't mind, and just wanted to quickly finish the tasks on his list. Anise showed sympathy, suggesting Ed must have struggled greatly having to handle the assistant duties alone. With a radiant smile, she grabbed Ed's sleeve and said that now he had her by his side. Anise tightened her grip, bringing up the topic of Ed being disowned by his family to establish a connection. She revealed that she was in a similar situation, having to fend for herself to continue her studies after her family went bankrupt. Anise described that time as lonely, like waiting alone through an endless winter. Ed thought to himself that this story explained why she always presented herself as capable and independent. He offered sincere comfort, telling her she shouldn't be too hard on herself for having made it this far on her own. Anise thanked Ed, grabbing his cloak once more. She gently said that they had a lot in common, but Ed realized she was acting completely differently from the pragmatic person he knew her to be. Suddenly, Anise cried out and stumbled. Ed quickly caught her as she fell into his arms, reminding her to be careful while she awkwardly apologized for tripping over a rock. He glanced at the flat ground, which contained absolutely no rocks, his heart filled with suspicion. Anise blushed in Ed's embrace, flustered by her sudden body heat, while he calmly used his hand to fan her. She hurriedly told Ed to wait and ran off, leaving him alone with a puzzled expression. From a distance, Anise watched Ed and wondered if his reliable exterior was merely an act. Sitting alone in the snowy woods, she admitted to herself that this mission was truly difficult. Anise analyzed her strategy. Since she didn't know Ed's preferences, she had created a persona that was both pitiful and clumsy to evoke his compassion. She recalled her plan was to create subtle physical contact and then pretend to fall into his arms. Everything seemed to have gone according to calculation. However, she admitted that perhaps she had overacted. Anise suddenly blushed, secretly thinking she truly hadn't expected Ed's body to be so muscular. Although he looked like a bookworm, he was much more solid than she had imagined. She also realized she had underestimated Ed. He wasn't just a naive noble, but was also highly capable. And then, she thought about his appearance. Anise suddenly understood why Yennekar was so infatuated with Ed. This realization made her involuntarily blush with embarrassment, but immediately afterward, Anise snapped out of it, her gaze turning sharp. She bitterly concluded that this was exactly how Ed had charmed one girl after another. With a determined look, Anise vowed to herself that she would be different and would never fall for Ed Rothstaler. Meanwhile, atop a snowy peak, Ed let out a long sigh. The magnificent scenery before him helped him temporarily forget his worries. But he knew there were problems that couldn't be solved just by running away, such as the issue concerning Tanya Rothstaler, whom he described as a genuine female villain. Ed knew his sister was a born political genius, possessing terrifying skills in deception and manipulation. Her goal was to become the first freshman student council president in the Academy's history, and she would soon begin recruiting influential figures. Ed recalled Belmaya's words that Tanya would arrive at the dormitory early, deducing this was a move for her to build her faction before the official semester began. Ed told himself that even though Tanya was a major villain, he could still prepare for her arrival. Standing on the windy, snowy peak, Ed realized the difficult problem. He didn't know how Tanya would treat him. He was confused because Tanya knew the true nature of Ed Rothstaler, while he knew nothing about his former self. In his stream of consciousness, the image of the original Ed Rothstaler appeared as a petty villain, only briefly seen at the start of the game. Ed bitterly admitted that in the game, that Ed was merely an insignificant background character who eventually ended up living on the streets. Thus, he couldn't guess what Tanya, his close younger sister, truly thought of her older brother. Ed bitterly muttered the conclusion that, in Tanya's eyes, her brother was nothing more than trash. Meanwhile, aboard the carriage entering the academy, Tanya Rothstaler gazed at the school, thinking that this place gathered countless brilliant stars. She listed the illustrious names, Princess Penia, Lortel Caheland of the Elta Company, and the talented elementalist Yennecar Palarover. Tanya also thought of the genius alchemist Elvira Aniston and Clevius, the spectral swordsman of the Nortondale family. She even mentioned the warrior who possessed the skills of a swordmaster, but above all, she admired Lucy Mayriel, the greatest magical genius. As the carriage wheels clattered on the road, Tanya inwardly sighed that merely thinking of those noble individuals was enough to make her heart pound. When the carriage stopped, she resolved to integrate and dedicate herself fully to her studies at Sylvania Academy. While a maid informed her that her room was ready, Tanya stepped down and ordered her attendants to complete the enrollment procedures for her. She turned to her attendant maid, announcing that she had a place she needed to visit first. With a determined gaze, Tanya declared that her first mission in this academic land was to deal with Ed Rothstaler, the one who had disgraced the family name. A letter from her father appeared in her mind. He expressed joy at her determination and fully supported his daughter's ambition. The image of her father, Krepin Rothstaler, smiled with satisfaction, encouraging her to make acquaintances with the outstanding figures on his behalf and solidify her position at the academy. Tanya clutched the letter, recalling her promise to her father and the 2 resolutions she had set before coming to Sylvania. In Tanya's recollection, the instructions regarding Sylvania Academy's rules echoed amidst the magnificent scenery. Even the most powerful individuals must respect the professors, as this was an academic environment. In a luxurious parlor, Tanya smiled as a male attendant thanked her for her time. She began her story, calling her brother Ed a stain on the family lineage. Tanya asserted that because they grew up together, she understood Ed very well. She inwardly gloated about her ability to naturally steer the conversation to create intimacy. Sipping her tea, she continued to criticize Ed as a hypocrite, lacking dignity, and ridiculous for having once been the heir. The image of Ed appeared in her mind, an incompetent fool who always acted arrogantly like an archmage. Tanya recalled the satisfying feeling when Ed was expelled, realizing that her brother's terrible reputation now worked to her advantage. The person opposite her asked a question, and Tanya confidently assumed that such a discerning individual must have seen right through Ed immediately. Suddenly, Tanya paused mid-sentence, overwhelmed by a strange and confusing sensation. She was stunned to realize she had been monologuing throughout the conversation. A white-haired woman with a scar across her nose smiled, reminding Tanya to always show respect. She revealed that she had met Lortel Caheland, and warned that she was not someone to be taken lightly. The woman's encouragement to try her best sent a shiver of fear down Tanya's spine as the recollection ended. Returning to reality, Lortel Caheland looked directly at Tanya and asked if something was wrong. The pressure from Lortel was visualized as a giant snake constricting Tanya as she was urged to continue her story. Panicked, Tanya stammered, asking if Lortel was angry with her. Lortel gave an enigmatic smile, replying that such a thought was absurd, which only heightened Tanya's terror. Lortel Caheland flashed a sinister smile, thinking to herself that the situation with Tanya was truly interesting. Meanwhile, Ed Rothstaler was reviewing his winter break to-do list. Most of the important objectives had already been completed. He had just finished studying intermediate magic theories, such as the burst point and the origin of wind. Ed inwardly felt fortunate that he could freely use the precious books borrowed from the late Professor Glast's library without time restrictions. He was also satisfied with his first day as a teaching assistant, although he noticed Anise seemed more exhausted than he was, before using magic to start a bonfire. Suddenly, a flash of red magical power from his hand made Ed realize something. He stepped inside the shack, intending to study more theory, as his magical power was too depleted for practical application. Inside, he saw a figure curled up under a blanket on the bed, and thought to himself that he was already too accustomed to her sudden appearances. Ed pulled back the blanket, revealing the sleeping Lucy Mayriel, and woke her up to ask her to light the fire. He easily lifted the sleeping Lucy into his arms, inwardly surprised that she was worryingly light. Ed pointed toward the pile of firewood, signaling Lucy, and the flames immediately erupted fiercely. Just awake, Lucy quickly grabbed Ed's cloak, insisting on staying outside with him. After Ed agreed, she immediately rubbed her face against his shoulder and kept sniffing him. As they sat by the fire, Lucy suddenly stared at Ed and said she smelled perfume. Ed suddenly recalled the moment Anise hugged him and realized her floral scent had likely lingered on his clothes. Lucy anxiously asked if he had a fever, surprising Ed that she could perceive his condition. With a serious expression, Lucy instructed Ed not to get sick, as illness could lead to death. She extended her glowing green hand toward him, offering to untangle the chaotic magic within his body. However, Ed gently reached out and silently stopped Lucy's action. Ed explained to Lucy that his magical power wasn't chaotic but completely depleted following her reckless actions. He quietly looked at her, muttering that by the end of this winter, her power might increase significantly. Unexpectedly, Ed asked Lucy for a favor, prompting her to curiously ask what strange request it was. The young man hesitantly suggested that Lucy should pat his head. Amidst the falling snow, Lucy rested her head on Ed's lap beside the fire, while he read a book and fulfilled her request. Lucy closed her eyes, her face flushed with contentment, as Ed gently stroked her head. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out, interrupting the peaceful moment and causing Ed to look up. Lortel Cahaland had arrived, and Ed casually greeted her, assuming she was there for the task he had requested earlier. Lortel awkwardly denied it, stating she had come because she needed to speak with him about a few matters in person. Her eyes immediately fixed on Lucy, who was resting on Ed's lap, stirring a mix of curiosity and suspicion within her. In a flashback, Tanya Rothstaler thanked a mysterious woman for listening to her plan. Flashing a confident smile, Tanya promised a lavish reward if the woman assisted her in punishing a certain individual. She presented an enticing lure, priceless artifacts from the Rothstaler family vault, intended for the Islan family, who were renowned archaeologists. The mere prospect of this treasure caused Elka Islan, in a visualized fantasy, to cry out in sheer delight. Returning to the present, Tanya's train of thought was interrupted by the appearance of a man with messy hair and an overwhelming aura. The man strode past, chillingly confirming her identity as Tanya Rothstaler. Tanya glanced over, her eyes reflecting surprise and caution toward the newcomer. She sensed his trained physique and surging magical power, secretly resolving that she must recruit this powerful person to her side. Clevius Nortendahl turned back, flashing a wicked smile as he asked pointedly, "Are you Ed's sister?" The second-year student's question stunned Tanya, but he merely smirked knowingly. In an imagined moment, he happily turned to tell Elka that this was Ed's sister. He kindly placed a magical engineering device into Tanya's hand. He explained that it would help her practice mana synchronization, even though Tanya was still bewildered. He even asked Tanya for the study plan she was about to throw away. Then he chattered incessantly, shoving all sorts of items he deemed useful into her hands. After completing his task, he sighed in relief, while the imagined Elka also smiled contentedly. Back in reality, Tanya trembled, clutching the box full of items, and struggled to ask if he understood their agreement. He just chuckled, claiming he understood the common conflicts between siblings and that Ed's personality was easily misunderstood. Suddenly, he introduced himself as Ziggs, a friend of Ed's, leaving Tanya utterly speechless. Ziggs continued to talk about his close relationship with Ed and praised Tanya's strong personality. He patted her shoulder warmly, while Tanya could only grit her teeth, silently musing on the sheer luck of the naive. Ziggs and Elka turned and left, not forgetting to loudly shout their good wishes. The accidental shoulder pat caused Tanya to fall flat on the ground, scattering everything onto the floor in utter confusion. The scene shifted to the academy office area, where Assistant Professor Cleo worked. Through the mirror on the desk, a figure appeared, along with words of self-encouragement after a long day. The reflection showed a haggard Cleo Elpin, utterly exhausted from work. She tiredly thought that once the placement exams were over, she would finally be able to rest. Standing nearby, Anise reviewed documents, and Cleo praised the stamina of her young assistant after 2 days of non-stop overtime. In the office, Cleo Elpin flipped through the reports, silently complaining that the new student assistants were useless, forcing her to redo everything herself. However, when she reached Ed Rothstaler's file, her hand paused, for he was an exception. Cleo recalled that Ed's paperwork was not only flawless, but he also possessed astonishing practical problem-solving skills, a rarity even among high-ranking nobles. Sitting opposite her, Anise also admitted internally that she was very surprised, realizing Ed was not as spoiled as she had assumed. Cleo suddenly leaned over, startling Anise, and then playfully asked about her impressions after accompanying Ed, suggesting that the two of them had a lot in common. With a sharp gaze, Cleo whispered a secret. She had been secretly monitoring Ed for some time during the Ophelis Hall incident, as part of her investigation. She recounted discovering the campsite Ed had set up himself, a place more comfortable and extensive than her own office. Cleo couldn't hide her admiration when recalling Ed's dramatic improvement in scores, reaching the point where he even earned recognition from the late Professor Glast. She was even more astonished to learn that Ed had contracted with a spirit, an achievement requiring extraordinary effort. Cleo concluded that she finally understood why Ed possessed such practical skills. He was completely different from nobles raised in luxury. Cleo smiled meaningfully, repeating the question about the similarities between Anise and Ed, further confusing the young assistant. Anise lowered her head, silently conceding that Ed was clearly not a bad person. Lost in thought, she realized she couldn't blindly trust others' words. After interacting with him herself, she found Ed to be reliable and diligent. Not only that, but he was also handsome, not arrogant at all, and had earned the recognition of Professor Cleo herself. Anise's thoughts grew increasingly fanciful. Ed was also thoughtful, considerate, had a great physique, and a pleasant scent that indicated he took good care of himself. Anise? Are you spacing out? Cleo's voice pulled Anise back to reality, leaving her stammering, caught daydreaming. To hide her embarrassment, Anise abruptly jumped up from her chair. She rushed to the window, declaring that the room was too hot, an unexpected action that sent papers flying everywhere, causing Cleo to cry out in alarm. Clenching the window frame, Anise heard Cleo's worried voice asking if she was all right, assuming she had overworked herself. Standing by the window, Anise realized she was in deep trouble. Confusion and panic were clearly visible on her flushed face. A terrifying realization suddenly flashed through Anise's mind, as she covered her mouth in shock. Meanwhile, Cleo was still engrossed in her analysis, wondering how Ed could have contracted with a spirit on his own. She deduced that Yennecar must have assisted through spirit synchronization, and therefore, Ed's spirit must be a trustworthy entity. But for Anise, that meant the spirit would report everything it saw back to Yennecar. She swallowed hard, trembling at the prospect of her every move being monitored. Completely oblivious, Cleo cheerfully called out to Anise, suggesting they go for sweets to take a break. When she turned around, Cleo only saw an empty room with papers scattered everywhere. Anise had vanished. The story shifted to Yennecar, whose family motto of harmony and compassion always made her shine. Although beloved by many, she still harbored her own private sorrows. Alone in the night, Yennecar wept silently upon learning of the relationship between Anise and Ed. A flashback showed Tanya Rothstaler eagerly rushing over to introduce herself to Yennecar. She panted, expressing her desire to introduce herself and converse. A separate recollection revealed Lortel whispering, manipulating Tanya into believing that Yennecar was the person she needed to recruit to her side. Tanya, perhaps hoping to impress, summoned a massive fire spirit and hesitantly sought Yennecar's approval. Tanya was only momentarily stunned before Lortel calmly reassured her not to worry. Yennecar responded with a terrifying display of power, enveloped in her own flames, while Lortel placidly remarked on her kindness. Lortel concluded that this very kindness meant Yennecar would listen to and trust anyone, thereby revealing her fatal weakness. At a secluded cabin under the moonlight, Lortel reported to Ed that most crafting materials had been gathered, with only the legendary grade items remaining elusive. She explained that they were extremely difficult to locate during the winter, assuring him she held no blame. By the campfire, Ed thanked Lortel for her assistance, but she merely replied that the task conveniently aligned with her other business. Ed offered Lortel a cup of hot water, gently suggesting she should rest instead of making such a long journey. Lortel smiled contentedly, stating that she came here precisely to seek a moment of peace. Gazing at the crescent moon, Ed mused on how swiftly time flew by when he was constantly occupied. He observed the frozen river, realizing that the stillness of winter was not perceived the same way by everyone. For Ed, winter was a hectic period dedicated to preparing for the new semester, marked by a long checklist of necessary tasks. Yet, he also knew that for some, the winter season brought a profound sense of isolation. Lortel suddenly looked up, a hint of confusion on her face as she prepared to ask Ed a question. She was astonished to see Lucy Mayriel sound asleep, resting her head on Ed's lap while he read, and immediately demanded an explanation. Ed casually replied that it was simply because it was winter, an answer that left Lortel utterly bewildered. For a brief moment, Lortel questioned whether she was overreacting. Ed sighed, admitting that he wouldn't have traveled here if his only purpose was gathering materials. Lortel offered a knowing smile, a surge of blue energy radiating from her hand as she urged him to drop the pretense. Ed was stunned, realizing that she had successfully obtained the item. Lortel confirmed it, summoning a brightly glowing tome from her palm. The magical tome slowly shifted form, becoming a carefully sealed envelope. Lortel held the envelope, smiling triumphantly, as she asked Ed if he found this interesting. She reiterated his promise that he would do anything for her if she retrieved the sage's sealed tome, as his own painful memories flashed through his mind. Lortel leaned in toward Ed, asserting that a merchant would never accept a loss after such significant expenditure, prompting him to wonder what she truly desired from him. However, she reassured him that she would not demand anything overly strenuous or difficult for him to achieve. Instead, Lortel simply requested that Ed stand on her side, a proposition that caught him completely off guard. In that instant, Ed realized the narrative had advanced to Act 3, and the direct confrontation between Princess Pina and Lortel was imminent. Princess Penia Elias Kroll, famously known as the Merciful Princess, was Lortel's sworn arch-rival. Ed recalled that in the original plot, Penia would become the student council president, subsequently leading Act 4 by exposing the dark secrets of the Rothstahler family. Back in the present, Lortel whispered that this semester would bring an event, forcing everyone in the academy to choose a faction. She turned to leave, emphasizing that all she truly desired was Ed's backing. Ed knew that the person who would ultimately decide the victor between Penia and Lortel was the story's protagonist, Taylor. He bluntly stated that he was not that person and that his support held little actual value. Lortel smiled, conceding that while Ed's reputation had improved, he was still just a student, and his support would not be the decisive factor. Ed frowned, finding it peculiar that Lortel would so openly downplay the significance of her own request. Lortel countered, asking what difference that made. She explained that the point wasn't whether his assistance was useful, but that it simply held a special meaning for her. Upon hearing this, Ed decisively agreed to Lortel's request. Immediately, she dropped the letter into the flames, incinerating the evidence of their pact. Ed watched her in silence. As Lortel displayed a calculating smile, Ed suddenly understood why she was called the girl with 1,000 faces. But then, under the moonlight, Lortel offered a radiant and genuine smile, exclaiming that she was truly happy. Ed was utterly stunned. He had never witnessed such an expression from her. Soon after, a new day dawned at the cabin during the winter break. Ed Rothstahler stretched under the morning sun. Although he had planned to sleep in, his ingrained habit of rising early pulled him from the bed. He asked Lucy Mayriel, who was sitting nearby, to help him start a fire. By the flickering campfire, Ed pondered his conversation with Lortel the previous night, finding that something about it still troubled him. In a flashback to that night, Lortel sat opposite Ed and the sleeping Lucy, asking about his sister, who seemed to harbor deep resentment toward him. Lortel revealed that finding Tanya somewhat endearing, she had introduced her to a few people, including Taylor and Lucy. She was certain that the following morning, Tanya would arrive to confront her brother. As predicted, Tanya Rothstahler, the sister of the body Ed currently inhabited, was striding purposefully toward the cabin. Ed internally noted that he had absolutely no knowledge of their relationship, as the original Ed Rothstahler's past remained a complete mystery to him. As Tanya approached with her 2 attendants, Ed could only sit silently by the fire, feeling helpless due to his lack of background information. Tanya hesitantly offered a greeting, noting that it had been a long time since they last met. She continued, explaining that because of the long separation, she had brought a gift. Ed observed that Tanya appeared anxious and fearful, but at least she showed no outright hostility. A sudden realization struck Ed as he observed his sister's reaction. He suddenly leaped to his feet in profound relief, concluding that the original Ed Rothstahler had at least been decent to his family, causing Tanya to flinch. But the name Ed Rothstahler instantly triggered a horrifying memory in Tanya's mind. In the flashback, a plate of food was violently shattered, followed by an angry voice shouting for daring to serve such wretched cuisine to the Rothstahler family heir. Kreppen Rothstahler looked at the young Tanya and praised her ability to conceal her contempt. He continued to praise his daughter's quick wit, then ordered a terrified maid to lift her head. Kreppen cruelly pressed the maid's head down into the wreckage on the floor, eliciting a cry of pain. The memory concluded with the image of young Tanya's trembling hand as she attempted to continue her meal amidst the brutal spectacle. In the horrifying memory, little Tanya screamed in despair, begging her father to stop. Silence enveloped the dining table as Kreppen Rothstahler sat there, ignoring the maid lying motionless on the floor after his fit of rage. He coldly asked Tanya if she felt pity for those who were merely tools. With a cruel smile, Kreppen reminded his daughter that she still had much to learn, engraving a ruthless lesson into her young mind. Returning to the present, Ed smiled gently, handing Tanya a thank you gift. He opened the box, revealing an exquisite hair clip, promising to wear it on the opening day ceremony, and thanking her for her concern. Seeing Tanya still hesitating, Ed turned and told his sister to sit down by the fire to warm up. Tanya briefly noticed Lucy starting the fire, and Ed reassured her not to mind her. The group sat around the fire, and Ed started a conversation, asking about the people Tanya had met at the academy. He casually guessed that perhaps Ziggs or Yennecar had told her stories about him. The moment Yennecar's name was uttered, Tanya and her 2 attendants flinched in terror. Ed didn't notice, smiling as he praised Yennecar's kindness, causing a panicked Tanya to nod repeatedly and hastily agree. The memory of a terrifying encounter flooded back, Yennecar summoning a colossal fire dragon spirit, easily tossing Tanya's attendants aside. Trembling, Tanya tried to fabricate a different story, but Ed realized something was wrong and asked if Yennecar had truly summoned a high-level spirit. Ed sighed, listening to his sister's messy explanation, knowing internally that the Tanya he knew from the game was not this timid. Meanwhile, Tanya agonizingly thought that everyone must have a bad impression of the old Ed, just as he called her name. Ed tried to reassure his sister, explaining that he was striving to live a better life, and that being ostracized was punishment for his past mistakes. He handed Tanya a cup of warm water, sincerely apologizing for being a terrible brother when they were back at the manor. Ed smiled encouragingly, saying he would cheer her on in the upcoming student council president election. However, deep down, he knew a harsh truth. Tanya would never win the election. Ed mused that, even though he knew Tanya was just a side character, he still felt attached to the first relative he had met. Nevertheless, looking at Tanya's stunned expression, he wasn't sure where their relationship was headed. After leaving, Tanya gasped, telling herself she had almost let down her guard. She staggered against the wall, reminding herself that she knew Ed's true nature. Yet, she couldn't forget the moment Yennecar erupted in anger, ready to incinerate her to protect Ed. Tanya realized that Yennecar genuinely trusted and was sincerely loyal to him. This was strange, as Sylvania Academy was inherently a place that gathered the most outstanding talents. Foremost among them was the legendary genius mage, Lucy May Real. Tanya believed that amidst such a crowd of elites, Ed's wicked nature would eventually be exposed. Deep in thought, she suddenly realized someone was approaching her room. It was Lucy May Real, and she noticed Tanya standing by the room next door. Lucy inwardly judged Tanya as clumsy, surmised that it was because of people like her that Ed went unnoticed, and then directly asked if she was Ed's sister. Tanya thought Ed was just lucky, while Lucy tiptoed closer. Lucy patted Tanya lightly on the shoulder, condescendingly offering help if she needed anything. Tanya stood frozen, watching Lucy's retreating back in confusion. She suddenly remembered one thing, that in this prestigious Ophelis Hall, only the most outstanding students received a golden nameplate. Her gaze landed on the golden plate of the adjacent room, engraved with the name Lucy May Real. Tanya was utterly stunned, realizing in shock that the girl she had just met was the legendary genius mage. It seemed Tanya would need a long time to adapt to the unpredictable life at this academy. At the academy's rose garden, Anise Halen earnestly asked someone for a favor. She eagerly requested that headmaid Belle Maya help her find an elite, tall, and handsome male student to date. Belle looked surprised, asking Anise if she didn't think Anise was the type to pursue romance and if she had any experience at all. Realizing her impropriety, Anise quickly explained that she only thought Belle was too busy and focused on self-care to have time for romantic matters. Anise commented that Belle's dedication was very similar to Ed Rothsayler's, causing Belle to flinch upon hearing the name. Belle was aghast, sweat breaking out as she realized the implication in Anis's words. Anise blushed, admitting that she couldn't fool Belle and that she was indeed thinking about Ed. Belle was stunned when Anise recounted that she had taken the time to investigate Ed due to the bad rumors, only to discover he was responsible and likable. Anise slammed a stack of student profiles onto the table, frankly admitting that she found Ed attractive, but considered it good news because it proved Yennecar had found a worthy person. She likened this affection to a malignant tumor discovered early. As long as she dealt with her feelings herself, everything would be fine. Anise spread the profiles of other male students across the table, planning to find a replacement for Ed, and spread dating rumors throughout the academy to extinguish her feelings. Belle was astonished, wondering if Yennecar had realized Anise's feelings. Belle stood up, sternly telling Anise that this plan was a great insult and utterly reckless. Belle exposed Anis's true intention. She wanted to find someone to date just to show Yennecar that she was interested in someone else. Anise lowered her head, beginning to recount that she had run into Yennecar yesterday on campus. In an awkward moment, Anise and Yennecar had passed each other without greeting, and Anise noticed her friend looked very sad. Anise burst into tears, expressing her guilt toward Yennecar, especially since she had to supervise Ed during the exam next week. Belle calmly looked at Anise, suggesting that the issue might not be as serious as she thought. Belle even said that this situation might turn out for the better, causing Anise to look up in confusion. Belle reiterated that Yennecar was kind and sincere, and that her two friends, Anise and Clara, had always been there to protect her from harm. Belle Maya explained to Anise that Yennecar's problem was her excessive perfectionism, and sometimes, that attitude wasn't always beneficial. Placing a hand on the sobbing Anise's shoulder, Belle expressed gratitude for being trusted with the confession, though she was surprised to see Anise in such a state. Anise suddenly realized the truth when Belle stated that imperfection is what creates charm and awakens others' protective instincts. In a flashback, a couple discussed how, instead of seducing a man, One should make him feel the need to protect her, that is the true protective instinct. Comforted by Belle, Anissa's mind gradually cleared. She no longer felt guilty and began thinking about Yennecar. Amidst her tears, a sudden smile bloomed on Anissa's lips. She knew exactly where Yennecar would go whenever she was confused and exhausted the secluded log cabin in the snowy forest. Sure enough, Yennecar was there, and she spoke up, asking Ed Rothstaler, who had just emerged from the shadows, how long he had been there. Ed paid her no mind, his thoughts preoccupied with calculating the materials needed to build a storage shed and expand his living quarters before time ran out. Yennecar simply sat down quietly by the fire, enveloped in the silence of the winter night. Ed finally noticed her quiet presence and glanced over subtly. Without a word, he silently poured a hot drink into a wooden mug. Ed stood up, draped a blanket over the shivering Yennecar's shoulders, and remarked that it was snowing again, seemingly every day. He sat down next to her, handed her the mug, and gently offered that she could confide anything in him. Yennecar lowered her head, sadly refusing, saying she couldn't tell him. Then don't, Ed replied, and Yennecar looked up slightly when she heard his words. Suddenly, Ed pulled Yennecar closer, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulder. Ed thought to himself that he sometimes forgot Yennecar's life was also difficult. Right now, she looked exactly like a small, cornered and trembling animal. He looked at her with compassionate eyes, telling himself it was hard to ignore her in that state. The two sat close together under the blanket, warming themselves by the campfire amidst the cold and endless winter. Spring was slowly approaching. Tanya reminisced about the past, when the Rothstaler manor was peaceful until the day her eldest sister, Arwen, the family heir, suddenly passed away. Everything changed completely when the next heir, Ed Rothstaler, a person entirely different from Arwen, took charge. According to Tanya, Ed acted as if the entire world belonged to him, just because of a small amount of inherited power. In her eyes, at the time, her brother was nothing more than pathetic trash. A memory of a confrontation surfaced, where Ed smashed an item in Tanya's hand and challenged her, asking if she dared to kill him. As she reached for the dagger on the floor, he sneered that his death would be good for her following Arwen's passing. He grabbed her hand, pressed the blade against his chest, and provoked her, saying that if he died, she would become the heir. With a crazed look in his eyes, he screamed, urging her to stab him immediately. Unable to bear it any longer, Tanya dropped the dagger, collapsed to her knees, and burst into maniacal laughter. She recalled the horrifying life at the manor, the moment his laughter abruptly ceased. He looked at her again with that familiar, cold gaze, the one that had haunted her for half her life. She was completely helpless, unable to do anything to save her family and everyone in the manor. But then an opportunity arose when Ed Rothstaler was officially disowned by the family. Now, Tanya was determined to prove herself, viewing the upcoming student council election as the perfect chance to initiate her plan. The first step in her plan was the placement exam. On the day of the new student placement exam, Anise Halen sharply demanded that the person walking behind her keep their distance. Ed Rothstaler was bewildered when Anise stated that she hated everything about him, from his scent to his very presence. A female teaching assistant announced that she had finished explaining the rules and urged the group of students, including Anise, to begin the climb in preparation. Unlike last year's exam, this year's placement test was held on the snow-covered Mount Wright. Ed mused that since Professor Glast was gone, Assistant Professor Cleo was in charge of the exam, and consequently, quite a few things had changed. The main change was that instead of searching for hidden mana-infused marbles, students would have to collect much easier to find magic stones. Not only were the stones not hidden, but the stones themselves did not grant the students any points. Anyone could aim for Class A, provided they could place a magic stone upon the substitute altar. However, Ed knew that Cleo was very much like her mentor, and she was determined not to make things easy for the students. This year's placement exam was called the Hell Survival Game on Mount Wright, where only students capable of fighting countless monsters and wild beasts could join Class A. According to the original storyline, ultimately, no one was able to join Class A this year. Ed let out a long breath in the cold air, telling himself that was at least how things were supposed to happen. He started moving forward, knowing that the incident where no students entered Class A needed to occur exactly as before, as it would lead to a crucial event later on. That was why he didn't object to the ridiculous difficulty Cleo set for the exam, though he chuckled internally that he would write a report later. At least, he could rest assured knowing that, despite the exam's difficulty, there would be no casualties among the new students. This was because they would be fighting phantom monsters created by the installed common-grade projection discs, which were only capable of summoning illusions of low-level monsters and wild beasts. Ed knew that the rare-grade purple projection discs were particularly important, as, to his knowledge, they were the main reason no one could join Class A. He watched Anise struggling because she insisted on carrying those important items herself. Onyx noticed she was falling behind and offered to help, causing Anis to awkwardly thank him and admit that they were indeed very heavy. Just then, another blonde senior assistant stepped forward, decisively demanding that Anise hand the bag over to him. Anise remained silent, confused by the sudden action. The blonde assistant yanked the bag, causing Anise to cry out as she lost her balance. She stumbled and slipped on the rocky mountain path. Immediately, a hand reached out and grabbed her coat, holding her steady. Ed quickly caught Anise as she stumbled backward. Anise realized her mistake in horror. The crucial purple manifestation discs fell out of her pouch and rolled down the rocky slope. Another male student rushed forward, snatching one of the falling discs. He managed to secure it just before it hit the rocks. The dark-haired student angrily scolded Anise to be more careful, worried that the discs might shatter. Ed sighed in relief while holding Anise, thinking that the storyline had almost been ruined right at the start again. Suddenly, a crack appeared on the disc held by the dark-haired student. The disc shattered into pieces right in his hand. All three stared dumbfounded as the fragments fell to the ground. The dark-haired student desperately asked what they should do now. Ed coldly released Anis, letting her fall to the ground. Ed recalled last year's joint combat training, a pivotal event where Taylor, a weak student, first wielded a sword. In that match, Taylor defeated Lucy to everyone's astonishment, a result that deviated from the original script and accelerated Yennekar's rage. This year's joint training session was another major event. Talented first-year students would have the chance to challenge the renowned main characters. Once it began, the match quickly devolved into a chaotic battle for survival. But all the challengers were single-handedly struck down by Taylor's blazing sword strikes. After a year of remarkable growth, Taylor once again commanded everyone's admiration. Ed recalled that, as the curtain fell, the Saintess Clarice noticed Taylor from within the crowd. He knew the most crucial thing was for Taylor to form a bond with the Saintess, one of the 4 heroines whose power was essential for the later battle against Lucy. Due to its importance, this fateful event had to proceed exactly according to the game's predetermined script, and for that to happen, the elite first-year students needed to perform as planned. Ed mused that the root cause of this stemmed from the placement exam, where not a single freshman made it into Class A, all thanks to Assistant Professor Cleo's excessive ambition. She had insisted on using the special purple manifestation discs during the exam, which led to the malfunction. Returning to the present, a group of students stood looking at the shattered disc, lamenting that its circuit had been twisted and would require repair. While the group stood around the technological wreckage, Anise bowed her head in despair, and Ed calmly observed the situation. Anise mumbled an apology, blaming herself for not being more careful. However, she quickly regained her composure, asserting that they had to do something, or too many people would easily enter Class A. Ed stroked his chin thoughtfully, confidently declaring that they could absolutely salvage the situation, piquing the others' curiosity. Then he abruptly grabbed the collar of the fur-collared student, his expression turning serious. With a threatening gaze, Ed declared that the responsibility for fixing this mess now rested entirely on Clevius, filling the student with extreme dread. The scene shifted to the snow-covered entrance of Mount Wright, the starting point of the exam, and Tanya's narration began. Tanya mused that for her, the moment she realized she had arrived at Sylvania was when she was greeted by the noblest people as her classmates. She noted that even the princess and the prime minister's son wore the same uniform, a symbol of equality, but there was always one exception. That exception was the spiritual leader of millions of Telos followers. The Saintess Clarice appeared. Her presence immediately caused everyone to bow respectfully, but she gently requested that they not show such excessive deference. As the students listened breathlessly, she explained that adhering to rigid etiquette would only hinder their lives at the academy. Filled with admiration, Tanya offered a formal greeting, stating it was an honor to meet the Saintess Clarice. Tanya confidently introduced herself as the heir of the Rothstaler family. Clarice replied, saying she had previously baptized the current family head, Crepin, and Tanya expressed that this was a great honor. With a meaningful smile, Tanya expressed her wish to also be baptized by the Saintess herself when she came of age. Clarice smiled gently, replying that she looked forward to that day as well. Inwardly, Tanya calculated that greeting the Saintess publicly would benefit the upcoming student council election, but that was not the main event of the day. Suddenly, a signal flare shot high into the sky, capturing the attention of all the students. The flare burst into a brilliant cluster of fireworks, signaling the official start of the placement exam. Students from the combat, magic, and alchemy faculties simultaneously set off from different locations, but all shared a single goal. Burning with determination, Tanya led a group charging forward, their goal nothing less than being placed in Class A. The rewards for Class A were incredibly enticing, tuition exemption, the right to reside in the Ophelis dormitory, free use of all facilities, and supreme honor. A smug, red-haired student held up the magic stone he had just found, certain that simply bringing it to the altar would secure him a spot in Class A. Suddenly, a purple-haired student zipped past him at breakneck speed, scoffing that he should run faster instead of just bragging. The two plunged into a chase through the forest, both heading toward the towering spire in the distance, which all freshmen were aiming for. Tanya gripped the magic stone in her hand, muttering that there was too much competition. She reasoned that the test couldn't be that simple. There must be some mechanism to filter the candidates, so she decided to move slowly and cautiously to conserve her strength. Suddenly, a short, brown-haired female student screamed in terror. The girl fell face-first onto the snow, her shoes flying off, right in front of Tanya. Seeing this, Tanya anxiously asked if the girl was hurt and offered to call an instructor for help. Contrary to expectations, the girl looked up with a mischievous expression and denied that she had fallen. The girl happily jumped up, explaining that she just wanted to try walking barefoot in the snow, leaving Tanya utterly bewildered by the bizarre action. The brown-haired girl smiled innocently, explaining that walking barefoot in the snow was one of the things she had always wanted to try. Tanya narrowed her eyes, feeling annoyed by the stranger's gaze and attitude. Thinking the girl must have hit her head somewhere, Tanya turned and introduced herself as the youngest daughter of the Rothstaler family. Hearing the prestigious name, the strange girl showed admiration and said she had heard of the illustrious reputation of the Rothstaler family. Tanya coldly cut her off, asserting that the reputation was untrue, which surprised the other girl. With a gloomy expression, Tanya bitterly stated that even the most noble families would produce useless trash after many generations. In her mind, the image of Ed appeared. She admitted that, even though her brother seemed to have changed, she still didn't know his true self. This was because the terror that the old Ed had instilled in her heart had yet to fade. The strange girl tried to comfort Tanya, but Tanya brushed her off, saying that troublesome formalities were unnecessary at Sylvania. The girl felt a little deflated by Tanya's coldness, but then she quickly regained her smile and cheerfully agreed. The girl introduced herself as Kylie Eckner, from the Duchy of Turin, and apologized in advance for not being familiar with the social etiquette here. Tanya agreed to call her Kylie, and they both realized they needed to hurry up since they were in the middle of the exam. Kylie innocently declared that she didn't care about scores because getting into Class A would make her too conspicuous, an attitude that greatly irritated Tanya. Suddenly, Kylie grabbed Tanya's hand. She offered to help Tanya pass the exam so they could become closer, then pulled a stunned Tanya away, running. Kylie hugged Tanya from behind, explaining that she had never had a friend her age, causing Tanya to yell a warning not to be so familiar. Faced with Kylie's innocent question, Tanya sighed, decided not to explain further, and simply urged them both to hurry. 30 minutes later, elsewhere, the red-haired student was panting but extremely smug about taking the lead and nearing the summit. Just as he regretted using all his strength, a giant, glowing red shadow monster loomed behind him, whispering an invitation to death. The red phantom roared a deathly sound, unleashing a devastating punch that knocked the red-haired student unconscious. However, the actual attacker was another student wearing a fur-collared coat, who gasped in shock at his own actions. He clenched his fist, telling himself that while the act was cowardly and unadmirable, it still had to be done. Just as that person had said, the task turned out to be surprisingly easy. In a desperate vision, he grabbed Ed Rothstaler and screamed the question of why it had to be him. Ed coldly replied that the consequences would not stop with him alone. Immediately afterward, a terrifying magical explosion shook the entire forest. Amidst the chaos, an ash-purple-haired senior student, radiating lightning, took command, ordering Clevius and Anise to block the path of the freshmen. She blamed herself for letting the incident happen, and resolved to use all her strength to resolve it. She assigned Onyx, the most skilled in flight magic, the responsibility of ensuring everyone's safety. Next, she requested Assistant Professor Cleo to return and complete the report on the exam changes, a task that would require staying up all night. After finishing the assignments, the commander turned to ask Ed about his role, while Cleo stood nearby, unable to hold back her tears. Ed decisively turned back and declared that he would stay here. He firmly asserted that someone needed to guard the altar. Cleo spoke up anxiously, as she could not sense any magical power from Ed at the moment. Ed simply closed his eyes calmly, confidently replying that he had a plan. From a distance, he observed the giant monster ravaging the forest and muttered that everything was still under control. In his thoughts, Ed looked at the broken scrying disc, admitting that it would be difficult to repair it while his magical power had not yet recovered. However, he had planned to utilize the high-grade mana stones used for this exam. Standing before the substitute altar, Ed placed the stone upon it and began the energy absorption process, determined to recharge his magical power, even if it took some time. Amidst the energy vortex, Ed Rothstaler smiled as he heard the faint voice of the spirit mug after a long separation. He was confident that Anise and Clevius would buy him enough time, while he himself had plenty of mana stones in his large pouch. Standing within the flow of jade-colored magical power, Ed declared his bold objective: to prevent everyone from passing this exam. He exhaled, his hair whipping in the energy vortex as he focused his mind. With a determined gaze, Ed announced he was ready and welcomed the challenge ahead. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Tanya Rothstaler and Kylie Eckner lay exhausted on the ground, Tanya panting as she tried to urge herself to flee. Tanya snapped that she was in a terrible mood, while Kylie behind her tried to signal her to calm down, though she also admitted she was quite tired. A giant shadow entity with glowing red eyes appeared, causing both of them to scream in terror, while Tanya resolved to end the battle quickly. From a distance, the male student with the fur-collared coat witnessed a massive explosion erupt. He realized the explosion occurred at the north gate, but the magic wasn't Anis's. Just as Tanya was dragging Kylie away, the fur-collared student yelled loudly, urging them both to quickly run away from the danger. At another checkpoint, Anise, the top teaching assistant, faced a freshman, even though her combat skills were only slightly above average. Although he was not an easy opponent, Anise decided to let him pass. That student, Joseph Whitefelts, was revealed to be a talent on a completely different level. Unlike his sister, who had to strive relentlessly, Joseph was a prodigy, the youngest researcher in the Magic Association. As a strong candidate for the top student position, Joseph told Anise that she didn't need to be sad about her combat skills. Anise fiercely denied it, asserting that her annoyance wasn't about that, and demanded that he move on. Joseph accepted and ran up the snow-covered path, leaving Anise alone with her thoughts. Anise clenched her fists, her heart filled with anguish as she recalled how perfectly everything had been planned. She was consumed by regret, blaming herself for destroying the magical item, failing to devise an alternative plan, and then having to rely on that person to resolve the situation. In Anise's recollection, Joseph appeared calm, showing no sign of irritation, and constructively guided the conversation. Anise bowed her head, bitterly admitting defeat to a freshman, and failing to complete the mission of blocking the northern entrance to the altar. But more than the feeling of defeat or resentment, she was angry at herself for constantly recalling the trustworthy face of the person who had stepped up to resolve everything. Ed Rothstaler calmly spoke, welcoming his first visitor. At a snow-covered altar, Ed faced Joseph, declaring that even though Joseph knew the rule was to place the magic stone on the altar, he would not allow his opponent to do so. Joseph looked at Ed, secretly thinking that the method of this examination was somewhat strange. He asked Ed who he would face next if he won, but Ed coldly replied that it was not his concern. Joseph smirked, assuming there must be a contingency plan, and admitted he was only stalling to assess the surrounding situation. His gaze fell upon the manifestation plate on the ground, noticing its unusual color and telling himself to be extremely vigilant. Joseph analyzed Ed, observing that his opponent looked like a magic faculty student, but didn't possess much mana, and furthermore, showed signs of having already used a magic stone. From this, Joseph concluded that Ed had an extremely low mana reserve, forcing him to use a magic stone immediately against the first challenger, and he contemptuously launched a fireball, expressing disappointment in the academy. With an overly confident expression, Joseph clenched his fiery fist, casually thinking about which sandwich he would eat after the match concluded. He unleashed the intermediate magic, Particle Burst, a vicious attack. Joseph was certain that unless one saw the hand movement and dodged preemptively, no one could evade this strike. However, Ed easily slipped past the explosion, startling Joseph into realizing that his opponent possessed real combat experience. Ed began gathering fire magic in his hand, and Joseph immediately predicted it would be either incineration or scorching. Observing Ed's hand pointing toward the ground, Joseph was certain it was the incineration technique. Ed released the magic, creating a massive pillar of fire that erupted from the ground. Joseph was completely caught off guard, engulfed by the flames in astonishment. Reflected in Joseph's eyes was the blazing sea of fire. He was stunned to realize the scale of the flames was far greater than expected, proving that Ed had trained his basic magic to a level nearly reaching intermediate magic. A colossal sea of fire created by Ed Rothstaler roared forward. However, the fierce flames struck a hexagonal magic shield and were brought to a halt. Standing behind the shield, Joseph Whitefeldt sneered, believing his defensive magic was impenetrable against a low-level spell. He confidently assumed that Ed lacked practical combat experience and would soon run out of mana, becoming an easy target for his counterattack. Suddenly, Ed called Joseph by name, causing him to flinch in surprise. Piercing through the sea of fire, Ed explained that a magic shield could block spells, but it could not stop a physical punch. Enveloped in flames, Ed charged forward at terrifying speed, delivering a punch straight to Joseph. As the devastating punch landed on Joseph's face, Ed coldly asked whether a mage should only prepare to face other mages. With blazing eyes, Ed emphasized the immaturity of his opponent's combat mindset. Joseph was sent flying backward, tumbling onto the ground after the sudden attack. Struggling to his feet with a bruised cheek, Joseph was stunned, wondering how Ed could pass through his own flames. Determined not to be complacent again, Joseph concentrated his mana, preparing to cast intermediate ice magic. In response, Ed once again used the incineration fire magic, confusing Joseph with the seemingly pointless action. Joseph guessed that Ed intended to use steam to obscure his vision, but he was confident he could also use other elements and began chanting a fire spell. He unleashed the basic magic, Scorching, sending a fireball flying to counter the attack. The two streams of fire magic collided, creating an earth-shattering explosion. Ed stepped out from the center of the explosion completely unharmed, causing Joseph to scream in horror as he realized his opponent possessed fire resistance. Immediately, Ed drew a dagger and attacked. Joseph hastily erected a physical shield to block the strike. Joseph broke out in a cold sweat, frantically wondering where Ed had pulled the dagger from, but still clung to the belief that his casting speed was faster. Joseph's eyes widened in horror as another terrible realization flashed through his mind. Ed threw the dagger toward Joseph, and it lodged directly into the magical shield protecting him. The dagger flashed with a brilliant red light as the spirit mug activated the spirit formula. Burst. A terrifying explosion hurled Joseph into the air, leaving him completely disoriented. The ground cracked and smoked, evidence of the devastating power of the recent attack. Amidst the smoke and dust, Ed's figure emerged, standing tall and unscathed. Injured and dazed, Joseph struggled to get up, reassuring himself that Ed's basic magic chanting speed could not possibly be faster than his own. But then a harsh truth dawned in his mind. It wasn't magic, but a spirit formula. Joseph was aghast, realizing Ed had used the spirit's blessing of recovery to pass through the sea of fire, and had deliberately concealed Mug's bat form within the flames to deceive him. He desperately looked at the technological magic items he hadn't even had time to use, realizing he had been completely overwhelmed by Ed's diverse arsenal. Ed coldly approached, making Joseph fearfully wonder who the person standing before him truly was. Completely defeated, Joseph tremblingly dropped the magic stone onto the ground, admitting his failure. The red magic stone lay on the white snow, marking the end of the match. However, in a final, desperate effort, Joseph unexpectedly launched a sneak attack. He poured all his remaining mana into creating a sharp ice spear, an intermediate magic spell. Ed merely watched silently, his gaze unwavering before the surprise attack. In a frenzy, Joseph roared and lunged forward, swinging a punch toward Ed. Ed easily blocked the weak punch and delivered a devastating counterattack to Joseph's face. For a mage like Joseph, who had spent his entire life only studying magic, a simple punch should not have had any effect. A gentle stream of green energy spread throughout the area, signaling that the match had officially concluded. Enveloped in the green energy, Joseph was utterly stunned, unable to believe what was happening. It was the Protection of Wind skill, a defensive spell that automatically activates upon detecting a surprise attack. The defensive energy did not dissipate but transformed into a counterattack, unleashing a destructive blast of wind. The force of the explosion was so immense that Ed himself was thrown backward. As the smoke cleared, Joseph slumped amidst the wreckage, utterly defeated. He struggled to rise, covered in injuries, his breathing ragged, and his eyes vacant. Exhausted, Joseph collapsed to the ground, his magic gems shattering as he bitterly admitted defeat. Ed approached, calmly praising his opponent's effort, acknowledging that Joseph's final move was an excellent decision. Amidst the desolate scene, Ed politely asked the name of the talented mage he had just faced. He stood there, majestic like a victor, looking down at Joseph, lying motionless on the ground. With his last ounce of strength, Joseph looked up and uttered the name of the one who had defeated him. Ed responded by formally introducing his full name, Ed Rothstaler. Immediately afterward, a senior assistant instructor ordered Onyx to take Joseph away, and Onyx used flight magic to carry the injured student out of the arena. The scene shifted to a carriage rolling through a snow-white landscape, where a voice echoed, asking Ziggs why he joined the magic faculty. Inside the carriage, Elvira questioned Ziggs, feeling guilty that she thought he had given up many opportunities just for her sake. Ziggs smiled, casually stating that he didn't value the title of top student, and wasn't sure he could have topped the combat faculty anyway. He explained that this was due to the presence of the second-year students, especially the head of the combat faculty. A fleeting image crossed Zig's mind, showing Clevius Nortondale, the top student of the combat faculty, struggling to fend off a fierce attack. Returning to reality, Zig squinted slightly, wondering about the strange premonition he just had. Clarice nervously asked if her holy magic was too strong, but Ed Rothstaler coldly told her and Tanya to continue the exam. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Clevius Nortondale collapsed from exhaustion, and his teammate desperately wondered how anyone could withstand such a terrifying attack. The timeline rewound to 20 minutes before the exam ended, amidst a silent space broken only by ragged breathing. Tanya Rothstaler was astonished to recognize the person standing before her and Kylie Eckner. Amidst the battlefield littered with fallen students, Ed Rothstaler declared himself the final test. He, who was once the object of fear and the embodiment of hatred, now coldly demanded that everyone give up. At the same moment, two dreams that had shaped her identity surfaced in the mind of the saintess, Clarice. The first dream was the teaching of Archbishop Verdeo, that nobility stemmed from unshakable faith. He instilled in young Clarice the belief that she must become a pure, blank slate. But the second dream was a silent resistance, that it was better to die in the mud than to live an empty life. Her eyes opened slightly, holding a hidden determination. That dream was ignited by a bard who sang of the beauty of the world outside her window. The person's songs painted vivid pictures of distant lands, from lush green wetlands to scorching red deserts. Every note plucked from the lute affirmed that the pure white of dogma was only a tiny part of the colorful world. That person was Adele, the keeper of the sacred flame. After leaving the religious order, Adele became a romantic, bringing songs of the world to Clarice's window night after night. Clarice's true dream was the outside world that her only friend had whispered to her beneath the stars. Because, perhaps, true nobility lay in an ordinary life, where people could attend classes, make friends, and love. In Clarice's memory, Adele once asked if a hug from the person one loved was more precious than countless prayers from believers. After leaving the church, Adele joined Sylvania Academy and began her journey to explore the world, living the life she had always longed for. Since Adele left, Clarice dreamed every night of the places her only friend had described. In her dreams, she experienced a vibrant, colorful journey, completely contrary to the monotonous, pure white life of a saintess. To make that dream a reality, she followed Archbishop Verdeo's instructions, carefully concealing her true identity. Under a completely new persona, Clarice was confident that no one would recognize her, though Verdeo remained worried. Now, under the name Kylie Eckner, she enjoyed the satisfaction of sitting quietly on a stone bench without anyone paying attention to her. At Sylvania, no one bowed in reverence. There were only friends chatting and playing together in the simple school life. However, one person saw through the facade. Ed Rothstaler, with his steady gaze, recognized her true identity. Give up. That is the saintess. Tanya was stunned to realize that the final opponent was her own brother, Ed, causing those around her to gasp at the appearance of another Rothstaler family member. Ed coldly demanded they turn back, but also warned that if they stubbornly insisted on advancing, he would show no mercy, unleashing a massive surge of spirit energy that flung all the students away. Joseph screamed in pain as he was swept away in the emerald energy storm. This power far exceeded the level of a student, surpassing even that of graduates. While veteran spirit masters could only control a few intermediate spirits, Ed summoned a high-level spirit, a gigantic wolf made of pure energy that roared across the battlefield. Faced with such overwhelming power, Kylie, terrified, advised Tanya to rationally give up. The painful memory of confronting a high-level fire dragon spirit in the past rushed back, haunting her. Despite everything, Ed gritted his teeth, pouring all his strength into maintaining this terrifying power. In Tanya's mind, a symbolic image of her painful past appeared, urging her not to give up if she wanted to change anything. With iron resolve, Tanya declared to Kylie that she would not abandon this fight. She asserted that noble status always came with unavoidable burdens and responsibilities. Nevertheless, Tanya couldn't help but feel skeptical, recalling the incompetent Ed Rothstaler of 2 years prior, wondering how he could possibly possess a high-level spirit. Facing the giant spirit wolf, she asserted confidently that it must just be a bluff. Confident that defeating the summoner would be enough, Tanya aimed straight for the main target. However, the spirit wolf suddenly roared, unleashing a terrifying surge of energy that flung both Tanya and Kylie away. Tanya gritted her teeth, struggling to hold her ground against the unbelievable power, wondering how this could be happening. From a distance, Ed Rothstaler's eyes observed coldly, gleaming with overwhelming power. Ed stood firm in the eye of the magical storm, the majestic wolf appearing behind him, confirming the existence of a true high-ranking spirit. Forced onto the defensive, Tanya and Kylie had to hastily flee through the forest, dodging destructive attacks. Falling to the ground, Kylie looked up and was stunned to realize that their opponent was Tanya's older brother, causing her illusions about the nobility to begin to shatter. She had once dreamed of elegant gentlemen, with generous smiles and graceful demeanors, but now, she was certain that Ed was the embodiment of the Rothstaler scoundrel she had heard rumors about. Even Tanya, in the past, had realized that the most prestigious families could still produce trash. The deep hatred Tanya harbored for her scoundrel brother surged strongly once more. Seeing Tanya fighting, Kylie called out to her, urging her to attack Ed according to their plan. Kylie smiled confidently, asserting that she would act as a decoy because her special physique would not allow her to die easily. Tanya turned back, anxiously asking if Kylie was seriously injured, and reminded her that she had previously claimed not to care about the exam. Kylie charged forward, yelling that Ed was the villain and that Tanya was her first friend. With a tearful smile, she affirmed that Tanya was the first friend she had made at Sylvania. Kylie's sincere words stunned Tanya, as she would normally dismiss such ridiculous statements. Tanya suddenly recalled that on the way to the altar, a senior combat faculty student had approached them threateningly. However, that person had been flung away by a strange burst of light, making Tanya wonder if Kylie possessed some special power. What astonished Tanya even more was that Kylie, whom she had always considered timid, was now leading the charge. Kylie screamed internally that she wasn't brave, she was just risking her life by charging forward. The girl ran straight toward the giant spirit wolf, blocking their path without hesitation. The colossal spirit sighed, appearing completely indifferent to the tiny enemy. Suddenly, the wolf's eyes flashed with extreme astonishment as an unexpected attack struck. It was Tanya, who had unleashed a brilliant yellow stream of holy magic aimed directly at the spirit. The blessing of holy magic activated, causing the spirit to roar in pain against the divine power. Enraged, the spirit wolf released a chaotic surge of energy, flinging Tanya far away. Tanya screamed as she was sent flying and slammed hard onto the ground. Ed Rothstaler stood there, looking down coldly and asking contemptuously if that was all they could manage. Kylie's eyes burned with determination. She thought internally that he was mistaken if he believed she would give up. Tanya struggled to her feet, her hands beginning to gather a stream of green magical energy. She cast the basic magic technique, energy discharge, firing a stream of power forward. Tanya's magical stream collided violently, creating a fierce explosion on the battlefield. Ed Rothstaler was thrown backward amidst the smoke and dust from the magical explosion. Tanya panted, wondering if her opponent had vanished. Suddenly, a glowing magical disc, a scrying disc, appeared in the middle of the smoke. At the same moment, Kylie Eckner screamed in astonishment as she was pinned firmly to the ground by teal energy arrows. A barrage of light arrows pierced the ground around her, locking down all her movements. Kylie was stunned, realizing she had been completely neutralized, unable to believe what was happening. Ed Rothstaler emerged from the smoke, wielding a magic bow, and coldly declared it was just a warning, stunning Kylie because someone who couldn't use a sword was using a bow. Tanya was also utterly astonished, realizing that the arrows were created entirely from magic. Behind Ed, the growling presence of a giant spirit wolf materialized, forcing Tanya to question if this was truly the Ed Rothstaler she knew. Collapsed on the ground, Tanya panted in despair, feeling everything was replaying just like in the past. Choked back tears streamed out. She realized bitterly that nothing had changed since she was a child. Memories flooded back the image of a small Tanya kneeling helplessly among indifferent adults, and she realized no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't accomplish anything. Just as she was sinking into despair, a voice rang out, acknowledging that she had put in a great deal of effort. Ed placed a red orb in front of Tanya, explaining that he couldn't go easy on her just because they were family. He looked straight at her, saying that if he did, she would only be angrier, leaving Tanya taken aback. Ed went on to praise Tanya's courage for facing him until the end, even if it was just in an illusion, and admitted that his perception of her had been wrong. The pin on his pocket glowed, and Ed declared that he now saw Tanya in a different light. With a slight smile, Ed affirmed that she possessed such an aspect, and something within her had definitely changed. Upon hearing Ed's praise, Tanya Rothstaler burst into uncontrollable sobs, unable to speak. Ed continued to acknowledge her efforts, moving Tanya even further to tears. Ed was bewildered by his sister's intense reaction, wondering if failing the placement exam was truly that devastating. Suddenly, Kylie Eckner rushed forward to shield Tanya, shouting for Ed to keep his distance. The brown-haired girl warned that there would be severe consequences if he made any rash moves, determined to protect Tanya to the end. From a distance, a female instructor announced that the exam was over and instructed everyone to gather to handle the aftermath. Realizing the ordeal was finished, Kylie Eckner was startled by how strange her own voice sounded. She panicked as a lock of her hair began turning white, realizing her transformation magic was slowly dissolving. Kylie recalled the moment she was knocked back during the battle, when the magical bracelet maintaining her appearance had been flung away. Archbishop Verdio's warning echoed in her mind, reminding her of the importance of always keeping that item safe. While the female instructor was praising Ed, Kylie sank into despair, thinking about her identity being on the verge of exposure. She realized with horror that both her true identity and her peaceful school life were in danger of shattering. Just then, Ed's fire spirit appeared, illuminating the lost magical bracelet lying in his palm. Ed approached and returned the bracelet to Kylie, instructing her to be more careful while intentionally avoiding a specific title. Kylie was stunned as she received the item, unable to understand why he had helped her. The female instructor anxiously inquired about the numerous wounds covering Ed's body, but he merely replied coolly that he was fine. As the sun set, the placement exam officially concluded, and Ed had successfully guided everything back onto the scenario's intended track. However, there was one exception, a minor change that created an insignificant crack in the flow of destiny. That change caused a pair of ruby-like eyes, hidden behind the world stained red, to begin focusing their attention on Ed. Kylie realized Ed had deliberately used honorifics when addressing her, and her gaze was fixed intently on his retreating back. The blonde instructor approached Ed, telling him to rest because he looked exhausted, and to leave the rest of the matters to them. She turned and ordered Onyx to go assist Clevius, and the student wearing the goggles immediately complied. While carrying an injured teammate, Ed looked up at the massive structure and thought he saw a figure, but quickly dismissed it, believing he was mistaken. Exhausted, Ed collapsed onto the ground, and a mysterious voice resonated, contemplating the eternal beauty of the sky. The voice continued to philosophize about the transience of art compared to the absolute beauty of the sunset, but Ed merely brushed it off as nonsense. A majestic white wolf spirit manifested in the sky, introducing herself as the high-grade wind spirit Marilda, and criticizing humans for not appreciating their fleeting lives. Marilda shrank down and sat on Ed, continuing her lecture about finding meaning in small things, making Ed secretly think she was indeed as talkative as Janica had claimed. The wind spirit pointed out that Ed's own caution made him blind to his personal safety, and he could only ask back irritably, "So what?" Marilda advised Ed to find someone to date, someone kind, cheerful, and strong enough for him to rely on, as the image of a radiant pink-haired girl appeared. Marilda asked Mug if she was wrong, and Ed's fire spirit immediately and enthusiastically agreed with her, revealing that Marilda and Janica were just close friends. Mug praised Marilda's advice as the spirit world's gospel, but Marilda chided him, asking why he couldn't pretend to agree with his master. Ed realized the relationship between Mug and Marilda was not master and servant, yet he still sensed the terrifying nature of high-grade spirits, while Mug frantically begged to die to atone for his mistake. Marilda suddenly asked Ed if he knew why Janica was sad, recalling the image of the girl sitting quietly by a fire, then playfully asked if he was worried. Ed admitted that it was obvious, but Marilda refused to reveal the secret that Janica herself did not wish to share. The wind spirit comforted Ed not to worry too much, explaining that enduring the winter was a necessary process for Janica to mature. Marilda concluded that the world is not a fairy tale, and sometimes one simply needs to persevere until spring arrives. Ed sat up as Marilda suggested leaving, explaining that maintaining her small form, though the most efficient, still consumed a considerable amount of his mana. Ed curiously asked about her other forms, and Marilda teased him, asking if he wanted a more beautiful girl, but doubted he could handle it. Ed recalled Marilda's gigantic combat form and wondered why her mana consumption efficiency then and now wasn't significantly different. Marilda lightly tapped Ed's head with her tail, calling him an idiot, and suggesting his failure to notice the difference was due to the supporting mana stones. Marilda challenged Ed, asking if he truly thought he had managed all the mana consumption by himself. The high-grade spirit revealed a shocking truth. A spirit like her would never form a contract with only one person. Ed was completely silent, his mind blank as he stared at the massive structure before him. He struggled to stand, wondering whose mana it was if not his own. Knowing he couldn't sustain the summoning of a high-grade spirit for so long, the answer suddenly flashed in his mind. It was someone else who had also contracted with Marilda. Just then, a voice rang out, suggesting this was not a suitable place to nap, and Lucy Mayriel appeared. Ed stood up to face the white-haired girl and asked why she was there. Lucy casually replied that she disliked an empty tent and had gone for a walk. Ed listened in silence, his face still streaked with blood. He knew, sadly, that the end point of this walk, the replacement altar, was the final stage of Act 3. In the original storyline, the suspicious St. Clarice began to realize the corruption of the Holy See, prompting the apostles of Telos to travel to Arkan Island to condemn her. Unaware of the truth behind the events, the Academy's key figures from Princess Penias' Royal Guard and Lortel's mercenary alliance to the Church Knights all followed the Archbishop's orders. Even the protagonist's party and Principal Abelforcius were drawn into this complex melee. Ultimately, everyone's blades were pointed at a single girl attempting to defend Arkan Island. That girl, following her master's final wish, stood alone atop the altar. Regardless of being called a traitor or an infidel, she looked down upon everyone with unwavering eyes. That was the moment Lucy Mayriel awakened her true power. Single-handedly, she defeated all the main characters on Arkan Island and wiped out more than half of the subjugation force. But eventually, her physical strength was depleted, and she was defeated by Taylor, who had mastered the supreme swordsmanship. Ed recalled the tragic outcome of the original timeline. Only after Lucy Mayriel collapsed in a pool of blood did the world belatedly discover the truth behind her actions. The belated realization that she was not the villain was more painful than any misunderstanding. He mused that perhaps due to her nature, Lucy had chosen to bear the entire burden in silence until the very end. Ed clenched his fist, resolute that he would never sacrifice her for the predetermined scenario. He was not cold-blooded enough to repeat such a tragedy. In Ed's mind, the image of the dying Archmage Glock appeared, entrusting Lucy to one day use her power to protect the Academy. Only Lucy knew what a terrible burden that promise to her master, her only family, truly was. He knew she needed to overcome these chaotic emotions to prepare for the fierce battles of Act 3. However, Ed decided he wouldn't just stand by. He stated that he had just realized something. As a completely exhausted Lucy fell asleep on his shoulder, Ed finally admitted to himself that he felt lonely. With quiet determination, he made a promise to himself. From now on, he would always tell her before he left, so she would never feel abandoned again. Elsewhere, in a sun-drenched garden, a cheerful voice rang out, announcing that she had returned earlier than expected. Clara, the daughter of a prestigious Viscount family, brightly offered a gift box to the maid. The maid thanked her, while Clara stretched, enjoying the peaceful feeling of being home. She eagerly spoke of her plan to host a tea party with her close friends, Anise and Janica, whom she hadn't seen in a long time. With unconcealed excitement, Clara rushed off, her heart full of stories she wanted to tell her friends. Her voice still echoed, praising the wonderful flavor of the blueberry cake she had brought, while the maid's hand crushed the cake inside the box. A look of utter horror appeared on the maid's face. Her thoughts rang out decisively. This blueberry cake tastes like sand. At a tea party, Clara felt suffocated by the tense silence, wondering if her two friends were fighting. She sweated nervously, realizing this silence was completely different from Yennecar and Anise's usual playful banter, and she didn't know how to break it. Anise tried awkwardly to start a conversation, while Yennecar sat opposite her, silent and wearing a mysterious black eye patch. Unable to bear it any longer, Clara suddenly called Anise's name, startling her friend. Yennecar finally spoke, her red eyes staring directly at Anise as she fiercely questioned whether Ed had hugged her. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a simple wooden windbreak wall had just been completed. Ed Rothstaler realized that crafting low-level items like this no longer helped him increase his stats, and he needed to find another method to continue his development. He sighed, telling himself that thorough preparation was necessary to withstand the strong winds that were coming. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind, expressing relief that young Master Ed was still well. Belle Maya appeared, carrying a drowsy Lucy Mayriel, and announced the Academy's new policy. During the blizzard, students were only allowed to leave the dormitory when absolutely necessary. The headmaid explained that Lucy, being the highest flight risk, would be monitored by a rotating surveillance team all week, causing the white-haired girl to frantically reach out for help. Ed silently listened to the plan, while Belle pondered deeply. Despite Ed's familiarity, Belle insisted on maintaining a formal attitude, and declared she would continue to use honorifics. Belle looked around Ed's makeshift campsite, skeptically asking if he truly intended to survive the week-long blizzard under these conditions. She frankly expressed concern that the flimsy windbreak wall would not be enough to protect him. Ed explained that the wall was only meant to shield his supplies, and the roof of his hut had already been securely tied down to the ground with ropes. He also mentioned that he had stored all his hunting gear and traps inside the hut. Ed's true plan was to spend the entire week of the blizzard focused on studying magical techniques at the Soul Library. He confidently reassured Belle that he had another place to stay, which somewhat eased her mind, though she remained slightly hesitant. Ed noticed Belle's worried expression and guessed this was the first time she had to handle a blizzard as the manager. Holding the sleeping Lucy Mayriel, Belle Maya confessed to Ed that she had another worry concerning him. She tried to dismiss it, thinking she was interfering too much, but her words only made Ed more anxious. With a sincere expression, Belle Maya began to offer her blessing. She wished young Master Ed good fortune, as an allegorical image of a young man under pressure appeared in the flame. The scene shifts to a tea party, where Yennecar Palarover glared at someone, angrily questioning them about being hugged by Ed. Clara gasped Anis's name in astonishment, realizing she was the target of Yennecar's fury. Confronted abruptly, Anis Halen froze, sweating profusely in terror. Clara quickly tried to mediate, assuming it was a misunderstanding, but Anis unexpectedly admitted to flirting with Ed, causing Clara to scream in shock. In her mind, Anis clenched her fists, silently apologizing to Janica and confessing that she hadn't trusted Ed in the first place. She told herself that Ed looked like a playboy, so she was merely trying to investigate him. Yennecar asked again in shock, unable to believe her ears, and Anis quickly reassured Janica, asserting that Ed was not her type. Anis continued to list Ed's flaws, from his thuggish appearance and arrogance to his grumpy and selfish personality, to prove her lack of interest. Hearing the insults, Yennecar burst into tears, defending Ed and chastising Anis for being unfair since she didn't truly understand him. The atmosphere between Yennecar and Anis became extremely tense, leaving Clara sitting between them in utter awkwardness. Realizing her mistake, Anis bowed her head and apologized to Janica for acting unilaterally without discussing it first. Yennecar slammed her hand onto the table, tears streaming down her face, demanding to know why Anis had done things she never asked for, and how worried it had made her. Yennecar's thoughts flooded out. She was hurt by the feeling of betrayal from her best friend, but then tormented herself, wondering what right she had when she was nothing to Ed. Anis gently placed a hand on her friend's shoulder, firmly comforting her. "Don't worry, Janica. You are very special to him." She asserted that from what she had observed, Yennecar was definitely more than just a friend to Ed, causing Yennecar to ask again in stunned disbelief. Yennecar's eyes sparkling, filled with hope, as she wondered if she truly was special in his eyes. Crying, Yennecar explained that she couldn't be mad at Anis, knowing her friend had investigated Ed purely out of concern for her well-being. Relieved that Anis wasn't actually interested in Ed, Yennecar embraced her friend and thanked her profusely, while Clara secretly sighed, glad the misunderstanding had been cleared up. Clara had an idea while watching her two friends. Embraced by Yennecar, Anis blushed shyly as her close friend called her name so affectionately. Clara cheerfully stepped in to mediate, stating that it was all just a misunderstanding and Yennecar no longer needed to avoid the northern forest. Unexpectedly, Yennecar quickly apologized and bolted away, leaving Anis and Clara bewildered as they watched her go. Once they were alone, Clara turned to Anis and mentioned she had something she wanted to discuss. Anis, her eyes obscured, abruptly asked Clara to introduce her to a man, but was met with a flat refusal from her friend. Refusing to give up, Anis dramatically grabbed Clara, proposing that they should break all conventions and date each other instead. The two girls struggled humorously as Anis pleaded with Clara not to look at her with that expression, while Clara remained innocently confused. Anis, clearly panicked, confessed that she had lied to Yennecar and had hoped that being out of sight would make her feelings fade. Anis's hope shattered when she was petrified by shock following a sudden announcement concerning the scholarship students. A blonde female instructor announced that the scholarship students, including a delighted Clevius and Onyx, would continue their work as teaching assistants. The instructor turned to praise Ed, confirming he had performed exceptionally well and would receive an additional scholarship upon continuing the work. Anis was dumbfounded upon hearing that since everyone had worked together throughout the break, it would be more convenient and comfortable to keep the group together. In the northern forest, Ed met Yennecar again, noting that she seemed back to her usual self, and reminded her about finalizing her spirit contract. Ed brought up the memory of Yennecar visiting his camp, causing her great shock as intimate images of their time together flashed through her mind. Yennecar blushed, awkwardly denying the memory and claiming she had forgotten about it long ago. Ed smiled warmly, thinking to himself that he felt relaxed around Yennecar, as she was the only friend he had in his year. Ed's expression turned serious as he questioned Yennecar about contracting with the High Spirit Marilda prematurely, and she admitted to using a tactical maneuver. A legendary magic engineering artifact, Glast's Golden Phoenix Ring, was revealed. Ed recalled having told Yennecar about the ring and his future plans. Ed reminded her that she would be unable to use magic for a while, but she asserted that her power would return by the start of the semester. Yennecar smiled radiantly, congratulated Ed, and explained that contracting with one's first high spirit is considered a spirit master's second birthday. She asked about Ed's plans for the upcoming blizzard, and he returned the compliment regarding her diligence, while vaguely hinting at an event scheduled after the storm passes. Yennecar cheerfully brought up the upcoming student council election, suggesting Ed would garner attention, but he insisted he would maintain a neutral stance. Yennecar was stunned, failing to understand why she would receive attention, as in the original timeline, She was humble and generally unnoticed. She changed the subject, asking if Ed's sister was also running for election, and he confirmed Tanya's ambition. With an embarrassed expression, Yennecar probed into the relationship between the siblings, causing Ed a slight moment of confusion. Ed admitted that despite being disowned by the family, he and Tanya were still blood relatives who would inevitably cross paths for the rest of their lives. The memory of their estrangement pained him. He affirmed that he cared deeply and wanted to maintain a good relationship with his sister, causing Yennecar to stammeringly realize it was merely a family conflict. Suddenly, Yennecar grabbed Ed's hand, calling his name urgently, her face flushed and eyes teary. She asked about Tanya's preferences, hoping to find a gift that could help the siblings reconcile. Ed narrowed his eyes suspiciously, questioning Yennecar about what she had done to Tanya, causing her to frantically deny everything. He simply stared at her in silence, his scrutinizing gaze unwavering. Ed thought to himself that Yennecar was a terrible liar, and, as expected, her guilt caused her to break down and confess everything after just 3 seconds. He smiled gently, assuring himself that the matter was nothing serious. Meanwhile, an announcement was broadcast across the academy, warning of a blizzard set to hit by morning and the subsequent imposition of a curfew. Elsewhere, a mysterious figure held a golden brooch, unable to stop thinking about the scene they had witnessed just days before. The memory of the original Ed Rothstaler, a terrifying third-year student, and his colossal spirit wolf returned, bringing a feeling that transcended mere horror. The only feeling left in Kylie was discomfort, as she recalled her own moment of panic. She recalled Ed Rothstaler, his face covered in injuries, returning the brooch and attempting to speak formally, an action that confused her immensely. Back in her room, Clarice reverted to her true white-haired form, clutching her head in panic and wondering if Ed knew her secret, after all the effort she had put into maintaining a normal life. She remembered Archbishop Verdios, warning, if her identity was exposed, her school life would end, betraying the sacrifices made by everyone in the sanctuary. Meanwhile, Kylie overheard Joseph being mocked by another student for his failure in the exam. Their conversation shifted to Ed Rothstaler, rumored to be an eccentric third-year student living in a hut in the northern forest, which astonished Kylie. In her room, Clarice tightly gripped the brooch, realizing the approaching blizzard would trap her inside and cause her to lose the chance to confront Ed. Without hesitation, she rushed out and flung open the balcony door, confronting the howling blizzard. Standing in the freezing winter air, Clarice trembled, admitting her fear of Ed, the darkness, and the biting cold. The image of Adele playing the lute flashed back, reminding her of the freedom and beauty of the outside world she desperately longed for. A loud noise rang out as something shattered the window, a sign that some truths can only be known through personal experience. With fierce determination, Clarice leaped from the balcony, plunging herself into the blinding blizzard. Elsewhere in the storm, Ed's hand tightly gripped a golden magical artifact, causing it to emit a brilliant light. He unleashed a stream of golden energy, forming a protective shield amidst the snowy white night. Kylie, back in her disguise, looked ahead with a resolute gaze, telling herself she could not lose her freedom, and had to go meet that man to confirm everything. She began running at full speed across the deserted school grounds, defying the wind and snow. The small figure of Saintess Clarice gradually disappeared into the storm, alone and desperate. In another dark space, a black-haired young man with glowing red eyes snapped open, monologuing that darkness was the only thing he had ever known. He coughed up blood, recalling his most vivid memory, the older brother who had always stood by him when the rest of the family shunned him. That memory was the horrifying moment when he used his sword to pierce his own brother's heart. In a bloody delirium, Clevius Nortondale recalled the last words he spoke to his brother, which felt like a venomous curse. Returning to reality, Assistant Professor Cleo Elpin turned back to ask Clevius the reason for his hesitation, suspecting that another laboratory was trying to recruit him. Clevius quickly denied it in confusion. He stammered an explanation about the assistant position, confessing that he felt he had only been a burden the last time, while painful memories flooded back. Cleo maintained her composure, asking if she had misunderstood his dissatisfaction, while Clevius admitted the compensation was excellent but still hesitated. Cornered, Clevius awkwardly conceded that he could take on the job. Immediately, Cleo flashed a radiant smile and decisively told him to proceed with the work. Clevius was stunned, completely overwhelmed by her psychological maneuvering. Reluctantly accepting, he looked out the window where heavy snow was falling. Meanwhile, Ed Rothstaler was elsewhere, reflecting on how he had trained his frail body to its absolute limit. He entered his secret library, pulling a cord to illuminate the space with magic. Ed recalled giving Ziggs money for a quick magical cleanup, but was surprised that he had also meticulously organized the books. He ran his hand over the neatly categorized books, thinking that Ziggs must have been extremely careful, despite the location being a secret. Ed guessed that Ziggs had received help from Elka, and that the two considered the task a form of training, leaving him feeling indebted to them. Deciding to start his work, Ed concluded that prioritizing and focusing was more important than learning hundreds of formulas. His goal was to craft at least one of two legendary magical engineering artifacts, Glock's Eye or Delheim's Hourglass. Ed carried a stack of books and materials, planning to mass-produce low-grade items to hone his skills before attempting the rarer artifacts. He had thoroughly reviewed the components and now only needed the tools to begin. However, when he searched through his inventory bag, he couldn't find them. Ed jumped up, realizing in shock that he had left all his tools back at the cabin. Struggling to his feet from the snowy ground, Ed Rothstaler decided he had to go back. He strode alone through the desolate forest, telling himself it was time for his body to move. Meanwhile, Kylie Eckner was also trudging through the snow, contemplating the monotony of a world consisting only of white. She yearned for the romance of vibrant, multicolored life, but could not find it amidst the endless blizzard. Recalling the map, she followed the frozen river, believing it would lead her to the cabin. The girl's eyes shone with excitement, feeling as though she was embarking on a true adventure. Her holy light blessing power was capable of reflecting double the damage back onto anyone who intended to harm her. Protected by this power, she ran fearlessly straight toward the cabin, safe from all wild beasts or bandits. However, the image of Ed holding a menacing magical weapon flashed in her mind, as she knew her blessing would be nullified if he was also a member of the Telos Church. Peeking through the window, she recalled the core rule: do no harm to fellow believers. With determined eyes, Kylie told herself it was time to confirm whether Ed knew her true identity. Inside, Ed was struggling with a large cauldron filled with red liquid, frustrated that he couldn't open the lid. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Kylie stood stunned in the doorway as the cauldron tipped over, splashing its contents everywhere. Her gaze fell upon an iron gauntlet lying in a pool of dark red liquid, like blood, on the floor. A feeling of utter shock and confusion overwhelmed her. Cold sweat broke out as she tried to rationalize the horrific sight before her. Then she screamed when she saw a severed, bloody monster head lying exposed. Her terrified eyes scanned the room, stopping at a blood-stained saw on the table. The overturned bucket spilled its bright red liquid everywhere, and she realized a terrible truth. Blood was everywhere. Submerged in terror, Kylie wondered if she was in hell. Suddenly, she flinched upon hearing approaching footsteps. Her eyes were fixed on the pool of blood on the floor, paralyzed by fear. The cabin door was abruptly thrown open. A tall, hooded figure stood imposing amidst the blizzard, their eyes glowing menacingly. The figure stepped inside and tossed something bloody onto the floor. Overwhelmed by fright, Kylie quickly curled up and hid under the table as the figure approached. The heavy footsteps of the stranger stopped right in front of her hiding spot. He placed a blood-stained bear trap on the floor, causing Kylie to silently burst into tears. He then casually picked up the blood-covered tools from the table. A cold light reflected off the large blade he was holding. Unable to suppress it any longer, an involuntary sob escaped Kylie's throat. She trembled violently, knowing she had been discovered. The figure slowly turned toward her. He bent down, his voice, cold as ice, echoing from beneath the hood. "Who are you?" His eyes narrowed as he recognized the person hiding. Ed pulled his hood down and asked in surprise, "Kylie Eckner? What are you doing here, and why are you shaking?" Before he could finish his sentence, Kylie screamed in desperation, unleashing a blinding torrent of holy light. Ed was thrown backward by the sudden burst of power, his body enveloped in intense light. The energy explosion sent the cabin's contents flying, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. Amidst the thick smoke and dust, a figure slowly rose after the explosion. Lying on the ground, Ed Rothstaler was covered in blood, causing Clarice to stammer in panic that she hadn't meant to do it. The young woman continued to mutter unconsciously, unable to believe what she had just caused. Seeing Ed's motionless body, Clarice realized in horror that she had murdered someone. With bloodied hands, she clasped them together and prayed through her tears, confessing her grave sin to the god Telos. Clarice sobbed uncontrollably, believing she was defiled, and must endure the punishment of hell to atone for her crime. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her collar tightly, interrupting her desperate confession. With purple eyes blazing with fury, Ed roared, demanding to know if she was mocking him. Clarice let out a piercing scream, her soul seemingly leaving her body at the realization that Ed was still alive. Ed angrily threw the girl down onto the cold ground. He gritted his teeth, his bloodied and wounded face clearly showing his pain and indignation. Meanwhile, at the Office Hall, which was engulfed in a snowstorm, a maid urgently reported the incident to the head maid. When asked to alert everyone, Belle Maya coldly refused, demanding efficient action that would not disrupt the hall's operations. Belle Maya, The head maid of Ophelis Hall was fully aware that Kylie Eckner's true identity was that of the Saintess. Another maid secretly admired Belle's composure, as she maintained her cool demeanor despite knowing the Saintess was missing in the blizzard. Trusting that the blessings of divine magic would protect Clarisse, Belle decided to take secret action herself. Donning her winter cloak, Belle ordered her subordinates to look after the students, specifically emphasizing Lucy. Just then, another maid rushed in, reporting breathlessly that someone had seen Kylie heading towards the northern forest. Belle Maya froze when she heard the name of the northern forest. In her mind, the image of Ed Rothstaler appeared, the man who had strange relationships with the women around him, and she knew that was his territory. A familiar scenario played out in Belle Maya's mind. A man and a woman trapped in a snowstorm, forced to rely on each other. Her imagination conjured a scene of Ed Rothstaler embracing a white-haired Clarisse in the warm firelight, leaving her stunned by the vision. Snapping out of her daze, Belle Maya blushed in embarrassment, chastising herself for having such frivolous thoughts during a crisis. Without hesitation, she plunged herself into the blinding white snow. Gasping for breath, she hurried away, telling herself she had to find them as quickly as possible. She was well aware of the rumors circulating about a suspicious man in the northern forest, one who often walked around with bloody animal carcasses slung over his shoulder. Those rumors had spread among all the students, but Belle knew the truth behind those stories, and she conjured a small fireball to light her way through the dark night. Heading toward the faint light of the distant log cabin, she quickened her pace. The footprints in the snow indicated that she had arrived at the correct location. Belle recalled that despite Ed's distant exterior, he was actually a considerate and trustworthy person who always fulfilled his duties, even with many women surrounding him. However, the thought of those complicated relationships gave her a headache, especially since she believed Ed still didn't know Kylie's true identity. As a snow-covered foot crossed the threshold, a voice from inside rang out, confirming that he already knew who had arrived. Belle was stunned by the sight before her, the injured Ed sitting on the floor, while Kylie held a chair up defensively. Ed calmly greeted her. With a bewildered expression, Belle Maya stammered Ed's name and demanded an explanation for the bizarre situation. After hearing the story, she thanked Ed but remained worried that they needed to bring Kylie back before the blizzard worsened. Ed agreed, acknowledging that the head maid of Ophelis Hall being absent for too long was also not ideal. He secretly pondered the real reason the Saintess had traveled all the way here. In Ed's memory, Clarisse's attempts to help him always felt awkward, and he knew her identity should have remained secret for much longer. He realized she was starting to suspect him, a development that was not part of the plan. He decided to defuse the situation by apologizing for his rude behavior. Ed calmly asked the Saintess to put the chair down, leaving both Clarisse and Belle Maya stunned. Belle Maya shrieked in astonishment at the title, Saintess, while Clarisse, equally panicked, nearly dropped the chair. Ed admitted he knew her identity, explaining that as a follower of Telos, he could recognize her when her disguise weakened. Still flustered, Clarisse awkwardly lowered the chair at his prompting. In his thoughts, Ed reaffirmed that his plan remained unchanged. He was determined not to get involved with any of the main characters. However, he realized that if the situation continued, the Saintess Clarisse might do something unpredictable. Therefore, Ed decided that revealing he knew her identity was the best way to alleviate her anxiety. He told Clarisse that he understood she must be exhausted from hiding her identity and living such a constrained life. Clarisse was confused and slightly moved by his understanding words. However, Ed suddenly turned the tables, asking her what she thought of the free life he was living in this forest. Clarisse's eyes reflected deep contemplation as she tried to find an answer to his question. She suddenly realized that this man's life was not freedom, but a struggle for survival. Clarisse mused on the two sides of the issue. If Adele was the one who romanticized the beauty of freedom, then Ed was the embodiment of the grim, dark side of that very freedom. Ed apologized for his abrupt words, explaining that he just thought someone should tell her the truth. Afterward, he coldly demanded that both of them leave immediately. As they stepped out into the snow together, Clarisse apologetically thanked Belle Maya for going to such trouble to come all this way. Belle Maya replied that it was her duty, while internally contrasting the warmth they were heading toward with the harsh cabin they had just left. She glanced back at the cabin, which still reeked of blood and the harsh reality Ed was forced to confront. Belle could not believe that the man who had once blocked the path of the freshman had to live such a life, while Clarisse's ideals of freedom shattered into pieces. Walking across the white snow, Clarisse silently affirmed that her decision to seek freedom was the right one. After all, this journey had allowed her to meet someone worthy of respect. Belle Maya quietly observed Kylie, sensing the profound change in her following the encounter. A flicker of worry crossed Belle's mind. She wondered if the saint had developed feelings for Ed. Unable to guess her companion's thoughts, Belle could only continue walking in confusion. The harsh winter finally passed, giving way to the blossoming green shoots of spring. At the Laplace Bakery, Ed Rothstaler and Lortel K. Helland began a business meeting. Ed expressed concern about the inventory check, while Lortel calmly asked if he was comfortable with her plan. A chef with a subservient expression rushed over to greet them, inviting them to make themselves at home. Lortel casually commented on the joy of having a monopoly, prompting Ed to remark that she was the only one who found it joyful. She took a sip of tea, refuted Ed's words, and insisted that she was not someone who enjoyed harassing others. Lortel began to explain that the Laplace Bakery had greedily ordered a large quantity of unnecessary ingredients right before the snowstorm. Ed immediately realized it was a fraudulent order, created to manipulate the market by canceling it just before the delivery date. Lortel coldly declared that while food was precious, those who lacked business ethics were not worthy of tolerance. The rival chef knelt down, begging Lortel to ease the restrictions she had imposed on his business. Completely ignoring his pleas, Lortel smiled brightly, as if she had just remembered something important. She turned to Ed and invited him to accompany her to the afternoon class, causing him to silently marvel at her ruthlessness. On the way, Lortel explained that due to the snowstorm, funding from the main base had been cut off, forcing them to rely on their own resources. Ed was surprised to learn that even Lortel faced difficulties sometimes, but she merely laughed and confidently asked if he didn't know who she was. Lortel boldly stated that her expertise lay in managing money, and handling issues like this was essential for running a trading company. Lortel Cahelland was surprised by Ed Rothstaler's answer. Ed casually explained that he needed to stop by the library to borrow a textbook, reasoning that a little jog would be good for his health. Lortel was incredulous, wondering why he didn't just buy a copy since it wasn't that expensive. However, she quickly realized that for an average student, all the textbooks here were quite costly. That thought startled Lortel, and she nervously clutched her purse. She awkwardly asked how much the book cost, but Ed, seemingly understanding the situation, politely declined her generosity. Lortel sighed in relief, changed the subject to the upcoming student council election, and asked if Ed intended to run. As they walked, she mentioned that she had to prioritize the trading company, but offered her support if Ed decided to run. Ed turned her down, stating that he didn't want the position and wasn't sure he could win anyway. Lortel looked disappointed, but then her eyes sharpened as she inquired about his sister. Ed was surprised when she mentioned Tanya, and Lortel slyly explained that Tanya would never bow down to Princess Pena. Lortel asserted that even as a Rothstaler daughter, the power gap was too vast for Tanya to overcome. Ed pondered this, silently admitting Lortel was right. Given the current circumstances, Princess Pena becoming president was the most logical outcome. Memories of the original timeline flooded back, and Ed recalled Tanya Rothstaler, the less malicious villain, having to desperately scramble for every single vote. But in the end, she couldn't close the gap, and had to accept defeat against an overwhelmingly superior opponent. Returning to reality, Lortel probed, asking directly if Ed supported the princess. She was momentarily stunned, then openly delighted when Ed replied that he supported Tanya more. Lortel breathed a sigh of relief, confessing she was glad because she had worried he was like everyone else, admiring Princess Pena. She leaned close to Ed, whispering suggestively that he knew perfectly well she liked him. With flushed cheeks, Lortel admitted she had almost been overcome by jealousy. Confused by Ed's cold demeanor, Lortel wondered if she had done something wrong. Ed bluntly replied that he had no intention of dating anyone until graduation. Hearing that, Lortel immediately pressed him. What about after graduation then? Ed remained silent, but Lortel smiled contentedly, taking his silence as a promise. With a sly grin, Lortel declared that this was valuable information, as graduation day was not far off. She confidently challenged him, asking if he could continue to reject her until then. Ed mused that graduating safely was not an easy goal in the slightest. He recalled the story's final boss, the colossal dragon that the protagonist had to defeat. For the world to achieve peace and for him to graduate, Ed needed Taylor to follow the predetermined path. Clarice and Princess Pena had to support the protagonist so he could destroy the sacred lance dragon. In other words, Taylor needed to mature and make friends exactly as the scenario dictated. Ed reassured himself that everything was still on track since the placement exam had gone smoothly. He was certain that Pena would become the student council president. The scenario would return to normal, and he could rest easy. However, contrary to Ed's expectations, Princess Pena was immersed in sorrow in her private room. The scenario had begun to collapse as she restlessly gripped the bedsheets. With a fierce gaze, Pena told herself that she no longer wanted to run for the student council. In another dark corner, Taylor was also writhing in despair, screaming, "Why does it have to be me?" He cursed his miserable life and questioned the cruel fate that had chosen him. In front of Taylor lay a dual request form that he had sent to someone. A calm, dark-haired student asked for his reason, and Taylor replied that he wanted to learn from that person. Dissatisfied with Taylor's superficial excuse, Ziggs tapped the table and demanded an honest answer. Taylor frankly admitted that he wanted a duel to prove his own worth. Ziggs scoffed, reminding him that Taylor was already the first-year top student, but Taylor countered that the title meant little. Taylor revealed his ambition, listing a series of targets: Janica, third-year top student Drake, and even Ed, declaring that he would challenge them all in sequence. He explained that everything required order, and he had already laid out a plan. Taylor revealed he had sent a challenge to Clebius, the second-year combat faculty top student, but Clebius seemed to be deliberately avoiding him. He presented his route. After Clebius would be Alvira, the alchemy faculty top student, and finally Ziggs, whom he had come to notify. Ziggs wondered why he was included, as he wasn't the top student, then deduced that since Clebius wouldn't fight, he was effectively the second-year top student in name. He smirked, calling Taylor self-centered, and confirmed the audacious plan: defeat him, then Janica, and finally Ed. Taylor admitted it wouldn't be easy to defeat Ziggs, but Ziggs cut him off, warning that the first lesson at Sylvania was that he wasn't always right. Ziggs placed a coin on his shoulder, epaulette, stating that wasn't what he meant. He declared sharply that Taylor wouldn't be able to touch him, let alone Janica or Ed, since he couldn't even defeat Clebius. Ziggs coldly ordered Taylor to learn to face reality before dreaming of defeating him. After the confrontation, as Ziggs walked through the campus, a familiar voice called him Jix. A silver-haired student approached Ed, waved hello, and thanked him for his help in the library. The silver-haired student informed him that Wade, the first-year top student, was sending duel requests to all high achievers, and seemed to want to fight Ed as well. Ed pondered, recalling that in the original scenario, Wade Collarmore's challenge streak lasted from Act 3, Scene 3 to Scene 5. In the original timeline, Wade was known as a genius swordsman, the son of the Northern Border Commander, who had easily claimed the first-year top student position. Unsatisfied, Wade challenged his seniors and effortlessly defeated them all in turn. Even Jix was among Wade's defeated opponents, although it was an unfair match, as Jix had been exhausted beforehand. Wade's seemingly endless rampage was finally halted by Taylor, who had made remarkable progress over the past year. Taylor invited Ed to see Wade at the Freshman Welcoming Festival, but Ed declined, citing other plans and the fact that he already knew what Wade looked like. Ed thanked Taylor for the information and told him to take care. As he walked away, Ed mused that although he once didn't care, the energetic atmosphere of the academy was now invigorating him. The fresh air of the new semester made Ed's steps lighter. Watching Ed's retreating figure, Taylor wondered if he should tell him something. He realized that Princess Penia had seemed downcast lately. Taylor noticed that whenever someone mentioned Ed, such as Joseph, declaring he would challenge him, the princess would listen, with unusual intensity. Taylor observed Penia from afar during class, her mind seemingly focused only on the name Ed. He could clearly see that she was acutely aware of that name, and it seemed to trigger some memory within her. Taylor decided to investigate Penia's reaction further, before informing Ed. The scene shifted. The weather had grown warm. A green butterfly fluttered through the air. In the northern forest, the butterfly gently landed on Lucy Mayriel's nose, signaling the true arrival of spring. Lounging on a rooftop and enjoying the air, Lucy heard a voice praising her rate of progress. It turned out to be Yennecar, who was instructing Ed and commenting that his connection was much better, strong enough now to contract with an intermediate spirit. Ed internally dubbed this Yennecar's teacher, Janica Mode, a demeanor she considered dignified but which he found endearing. He happily played along, praising his excellent teacher, causing Yennecar to smugly clear her throat. Yennecar explained that to contract with an intermediate spirit, the user must find a spirit whose mana flow is compatible with their own, rather than relying solely on power. Ed admitted he hadn't considered elemental compatibility when contracting with Marilda, and Yennecar explained that this was because he was naturally suited to the fire and wind elements, suggesting he should seek a spirit of a different element. Ed silently agreed, realizing that while finding a spirit of the same element was convenient, it would make it difficult for him to handle diverse situations. He told himself that although he didn't need to master every element like Yennecar, trying a new field was the best course of action, even if he knew it would be difficult. Yennecar asserted that this was why people considered meeting an intermediate spirit an act of destiny, reminding Ed of the romantic image of a spirit master wandering in nature to seek a connection. Yennecar began the lesson, instructing Ed to focus mana into his eyes for the first step, connection. Immediately, Ed's eyes flared with magical blue light. A magnificent sight unfolded before him. Countless intermediate spirits that Yennecar had gathered were waiting. Ed was overwhelmed by the spectacle, sweat breaking out as Yennecar asked if he was distracted. Yennecar smiled proudly, boasting that she had spoken to all of them, leaving Ed only able to exclaim that she was truly incredible. At Yennecar's command, a swarm of intermediate spirits rushed toward Ed, leaving him stunned as he was told to choose one. A water spirit named Pello confidently flew up, proclaiming himself the #1 water spirit and showing off his wings. Ed looked unimpressed, while Mug on his shoulder silently judged his master's picky attitude. Seeing Ed's strange expression, Yennecar suddenly grew anxious, asking if she had brought too many spirits. Ed quickly waved his hand to reassure her, but internally he was screaming about his romanticized, destined encounter having vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, at the Academy's freshman welcoming festival, students were gathered and chatting. Principal Obel and Vice Principal Rachel expressed concern that the most outstanding students, such as Janica, Yennecar, and Lucy May Reel, were absent. However, their anxiety quickly faded. The appearance of one of Sylvania's most noble figures, Princess Penia, drew everyone's attention. Although the Academy championed equality, no one, not even the nobles, dared to approach the princess for conversation. Yet, one person alone broke that atmosphere, placing his chess piece down and declaring, "Checkmate." The person who had just checkmated the princess was introduced as Wade Collarmore, the first-year valedictorian and heir to one of the 3 great sword families. Wade picked up a pawn, explaining that Penia's hesitation immediately following her peace sacrifice was what sealed her defeat. He noted that Penia must have gained valuable insight, though he simultaneously expressed his distaste for applying real-world military strategy to the game of chess. Penia silently conceded the point. She had always been confident in her ability to judge character, but now she was beginning to realize the extent of her error. The princess recalled advice she had received, that learning to accept that she wasn't always right was a necessary step. Penia's train of thought drifted toward Ed Rothstaler. Initially, having him expelled had been nothing more than a trivial annoyance. Yet, Ed had saved Yennecar, constructed a shelter in the forest entirely on his own, and consistently acted in ways that defied her predictions. As time passed, the image of Ed in her mind swelled, transforming into a presence that could no longer be dismissed. Now, even the newest students spoke highly of him. Ed's reputation had spread far and wide across the academy grounds. Penia realized with bitterness that as Ed's influence expanded, the gravity of her initial mistake only deepened. She chastised herself, knowing she could not continue acting like a child. Running away from the problem would achieve nothing. With a resolute gaze, Penia reaffirmed her purpose at the academy, to learn, regardless of her royal standing. Smiling at Wade, Penia thanked him for the invaluable lesson and confidently challenged him to another match. While resetting the chessboard, she vowed never again to flee from her errors, recognizing such an act as utter folly. She planned to resolve all outstanding matters within 4 days, after which she would seek out Ed's cabin in the northern forest. Penia imagined the scene, she and Ed sitting by the fire, finally able to converse freely and as equals. A sense of fresh relief washed over the Princess Phoenix, as though spring had finally arrived in her heart. But that tranquility was short-lived. By the morning of the 3rd day, a sudden piece of news arrived, leaving Penia utterly frozen. Her hopes and carefully laid plans shattered, much like chess pieces being mercilessly swept from the board. A letter was sent to her esteemed father, detailing her days at the academy, instead of the usual correspondence from the Rothstaler mansion. The writer affirmed that she would not forget the honor she must uphold as a member of the Rothstaler family, despite the unfamiliarity of life away from home. Tanya Rothstaler admitted she was having difficulty adjusting to the busy schedule, noting that one classmate had even fallen asleep right beside her. She reaffirmed her goal of becoming the youngest student council president, though she was worried upon hearing that Princess Penia would also be running. Tanya also recounted her meeting with Lortel Kiheland, who exuded the aura of a perfect merchant, and expressed her apprehension about having to represent the family in the upcoming negotiations. Afterward, she hesitantly brought up a difficult subject, her older brother, Ed Rothstaler. Tanya wrote that, despite his expulsion, her brother seemed to have become diligent and hard-working, acting like a completely different person. She confessed that her childhood memories were unclear, and that she might be misunderstanding the situation entirely. Tanya described a strange dream where she returned to the hill behind the mansion, where lilacs and daffodils bloomed every spring. In the dream, she recalled walking along the path, holding hands with 2 people. One of them was certainly her older sister, Arwen. She wondered if the other steady hand belonged to her father. However, the image of a younger Ed Rothstaler appeared, leading Tanya to speculate that perhaps he hadn't changed at all, but was simply reverting to his true self before Arwen's death. Concluding the letter filled with complex thoughts, Tanya signed off as his beloved daughter. Krepin Rothstaler read his daughter's words, his hand resting on a dagger enchanted with deadly poison magic. Seated in his imposing armchair, Krepin announced that he had sent a reply to Tanya. He judged that the student council election and the negotiations with Lortel were too much for Tanya to handle. Therefore, Krepin decided to send his daughter a reliable vassal, handing a sword to the cloaked figure kneeling before him. Krepin explained that although sending vassals to Sylvania was against custom, the academy had permitted it for business reasons, and then ordered them to depart. As the two vassals left, the large door closed, leaving Krepin alone in the dark room. Krepin slowly removed his white glove, revealing a hand that was glowing red, deformed, and veined like a demon's. Krepin Rothstaler stared at his monstrous hand, muttering that he still couldn't get used to it. His cursed hand grasped a magic orb, casting the highest level magic, causality determination, which allowed him to foresee the outcome of a predetermined action. He lamented that this spell consumed too much mana, and that it was a pity he couldn't use it often. In the vision that appeared, the two hooded vassals stood on a cliff under pouring rain, preparing to execute a crucial mission to confirm an inevitable outcome. That outcome was a tragic scene. Ed Rothstaler, holding the dying Taylor, who had been run through by a magical blade. In the cold rain, Taylor coughed up a final mouthful of blood. Nearby, a horrified Elka Islan fled the carnage. Ed, covered in injuries, lost his balance and fell backward off the cliff. His bloody hand desperately reached upward as Tanya called his name from above. Tanya collapsed at the edge of the precipice, helplessly watching her brother fall, her cries lost in vain. She could only watch as her brother's figure disappeared from view. In a symbolic image, Tanya sank deep beneath the water, her eyes wide open, blazing with the red color of ultimate hatred. Returning to reality, Krepin looked at the image of Tanya's enraged face reflected in the orb, admitting that the feeling was not pleasant. Nevertheless, with a cold expression, he concluded that this was a necessary sacrifice. The narrative shifted to 3 days before Ed's destined death, at a small house under the brilliant dawn light. In a classroom, the results of a popularity survey for the student council president candidates showed an unbelievable disparity. One candidate's support rate was nearly absolute, while the opponent held only an insignificant fraction. This was because Princess Pania, with her illustrious reputation, was known and admired throughout the entire Kroll Empire. Tanya Rothstaler sat at her desk, looking dejectedly at the results on the board, realizing that if Princess Penia truly ran, her chance of winning was 0. She sighed, bitterly accepting that her own delusions were far removed from reality, and perhaps it was best to give up. In a fantasy, Ziggs greeted Tanya warmly and asked if she was heading to the elemental studies class. He kindly inquired if she was facing any difficulties and suggested they should have tea with Elka sometime. A group of female students nearby whispered in admiration, astonished that Tanya was acquainted with Ziggs, who was considered the strongest student at the academy. Immediately afterward, Lortel Cahelland appeared and cheerfully discussed a negotiation for the sale of magic tomes with Tanya, further stunning those around them. Even Sylvania's genius, Lucy Mayriel, paused to greet Tanya, leaving the other students speechless. The group of admiring female students was completely impressed, realizing that Tanya's social circle was on a completely different level than theirs. They praised Tanya's humility and dignity profusely, finding her amazing for having so many connections yet never boasting. The Dream Tanya even turned to encourage Kylie and Terry, saying that if they continued to work hard every day, they would both become excellent students. Inspired, the two promised to strive to become as talented and noble as Tanya before leaving. As the classroom door closed, Tanya fell into contemplation. She felt strangely that her standing at the academy had risen illogically over the past few days. However, a sense of unease washed over her when she realized she hadn't done anything herself. The image of her brother Ed, injured yet fighting resiliently, flashed through her mind, and she suddenly understood everything. Tanya slid down the wall, feeling terrible. She had once considered Ed worthless, but now she felt that she was the truly useless one. She buried her face in her hands in despair, unable to understand why things had turned out this way. Her eyes widened, filled with extreme chaos and confusion. Suddenly, her room door gently opened. Two familiar men, Kadek and Knox, stood in the doorway, smiling and saying they were glad to see she was well. They stepped inside, explaining that her father had sent them and that they were relieved to be able to assist her with her academy life. Kadek laid out the plan, stating that he would gather information on the market price of magic tomes and the financial status of the trading company to ensure her negotiations went smoothly. Knox offered to help Tanya in the student council election, specifically by gathering information on Princess Penia, who was rumored to be running. Tanya interrupted Knox, stating that it was unnecessary, as she had just received new information this morning. The person opposite her revealed a shocking piece of news. Princess Penia would not be participating in the election, leaving Tanya stunned. The scene shifts, and Yennecar is telling Ed that the royal secretary had announced the news, but she remained skeptical about whether the decision might change. Ed was deep in thought, his mind focused on Kreppen Rothstaler, the final boss of the fourth act in the original storyline. Ed recalled that Kreppen was known to everyone as the benevolent patriarch of the Rothstaler family, possessing flawless administrative abilities. However, only Princess Penia, who wielded power both within the royal family and the academy, recognized his dark nature. Normally, she would have become the most reliable ally, leading the charge against Kreppen when he targeted Sylvania Academy. Yennecar turned to Ed, confusedly asking why the princess wasn't running, and she began to sense that something was amiss. She worried that Ed was about to do something reckless again, and she couldn't tolerate him getting hurt on his own without her knowledge. Yennecar asserted that Ed had suffered enough, and regardless of his plan, she would help him. Ed calmly replied, confessing that he honestly thought it would be better if Princess Penia became the student council president. Yennecar was surprised, pointing out that the princess had treated Ed poorly and that Tanya was his sister. But she also wondered about the reason behind Penia's decision. Ed warned Yennecar that many people were watching, and just then, Ziggs appeared, teasing them about their intimate behavior in broad daylight. After greeting them, Ziggs apologized for the interruption and stated that he knew why Princess Penia was not running for election. Yennecar blushed and objected to Ziggs' choice of words, while he began to explain, using an analogy for the princess' current state. Ziggs compared her to an alpha wolf who had lost its pack. He explained that due to one wrong choice, the entire pack had perished, leaving the alpha wolf emotionally numb. It showed no reaction whatsoever, even when an arrow was aimed directly at it. The scene shifted to the resolute amber eyes of Taylor, who was implied to be that threat. Ziggs concluded that Princess Penia's eyes now resembled those of someone who had lost all confidence and will. With that, he turned and left, casually mentioning that it would rain tomorrow, a warning Ed knew he couldn't dismiss, as Ziggs' instincts were sharp. Ziggs' words plunged Ed into contemplation of the worst-case scenario. Penia had completely given up on confronting the Rothstaler family. Faced with this massive variable, Ed wondered what he should do next. But then, a flash of determination sparked in his eyes. A new idea had formed. Yennecar, completely unaware, excitedly suggested that the approaching rain was the perfect opportunity for them to go to the northern cliffs to train water spirits together. Ed silently calculated, arranging his new plan after the elemental studies class concluded. After a moment of silence, he made his decision. Ed smiled and thanked Yennecar, agreeing that for now, they should just do what they could. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Lucy Mayriel stirred awake. Lying on a wooden rooftop, she lazily looked up at the sky and sensed the approaching rain. Her purple eyes suddenly widened as a thought abruptly struck her. Lucy jumped up, powerfully splitting a log with magic. With a determined expression, she pointed forward, ready for action. The scene shifted to a campfire burning in a quiet forest. From behind a tree trunk, Ed cautiously observed the area ahead. He stepped into the clearing, where Lucy was sleeping soundly on a log, and silently realized that spring had finally arrived. Inside the cabin, Ed looked out, thinking that the rain would make travel more difficult. Raindrops began to fall, lightly dusting the sleeping Lucy, and they seemed to carry a sense of melancholy. The fire still flickered weakly, struggling against the increasingly heavy rain. The torrential rain extinguished the campfire, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke in the gloom. Amidst the desolate landscape, Ed Rothstaler, clad in a hooded cloak, stepped out to the edge of the cliff, gazing upon the northern coastline for the first time. He silently noted the remoteness and isolation of the location, while the spirit mug curiously poked its head out from his cloak. Ed determined this was the perfect spot for training, but Mug quickly spoke up, praising its master's decision to contract with the water spirit Lisha. While Mug was still rambling about combining spirits with mana arrows, Ed decisively ordered it to be silent. Suddenly, he drew his bow, a blue mana arrow aimed directly at two approaching cloaked figures, and offered a greeting. The two strangers pulled down their hoods, revealing themselves as two loyal vassals of Kreppen, the silver-haired Kadek and a dark-haired man brandishing a dagger laced with dark magic. Ed narrowed his eyes, inwardly thinking that the appearance of Kreppen's close subordinates here was not a good sign. He sarcastically returned their greeting, wondering why he was still called young master despite being abandoned by the family. The dark-haired vassal got straight to the point, declaring that they had come here under Kreppen's orders with a single objective: to assassinate Ed. Just as the threat ended, he added one word, however, which momentarily surprised Ed. Suddenly, both vassals knelt down, declaring that they regretted harboring hatred toward him. The dark-haired vassal placed the poisoned dagger on the ground, confessing that this was the weapon they intended to use to finish him off. He explained that after investigating, they realized Ed had rediscovered his true self and was no longer the tyrant of the past. Both men bowed their heads low to the ground, urgently pleading for Ed to return to his position as heir, to restore honor to the Rothstaler family. Ed stood silently, watching the two men perform their earnest act under the heavy rain. Finally, he coldly broke the silence with a harsh statement. Enough with the nonsense. The act concluded, and the two vassals looked up, a sinister smile on their lips, as they realized their young master had truly matured. Without warning, Kadek lunged forward, transforming into a green blur of sword aura, the title Eagle Knight, echoing with his attack. Facing the deadly surge of energy, Ed remained still, his gaze calm and sharp, as if he had foreseen everything. Nox's eyes flared with furious light, signaling an imminent explosive attack. He roared, his entire body engulfed in raging flames as he swung his blazing fist forward. The brown bear knight Nox, wielder of the flaming mace, unleashed a fierce assault, forcing Ed to struggle and fall back. With a determined expression, Ed drew his bow, channeling blue magical energy to prepare his counterattack. Meanwhile, Kadek moved at blinding speed, creating after-images as he swung his pair of magic-enhanced daggers. Both vassals stood facing Ed, and Kadek asked if the young master still remembered a person named Meliana. A painful memory surfaced, the young girl Meliana lying on the floor, one eye ruined by the cruel pastime of the past Ed. Hearing his daughter's name, Nox roared in agony and fury, charging forward with his blazing fist. A massive fire explosion erupted, engulfing the space where Ed stood. Nox coldly acknowledged the past, but his gaze revealed his unwavering intent for vengeance. Amidst the sea of fire, Ed knelt, protected by a blue energy sphere, and declared that vengeance was meaningless. He continued, asserting that he, too, knew that the only thing awaiting at the end of the path of revenge was emptiness. Nox frantically swung the flaming mace down, yelling that Ed had no right to utter those words, and Ed calmly admitted it. From afar, Kadek observed, acknowledging Ed's growth but still believing he couldn't possibly block Nox's magical mace. Ed leaned back, narrowly dodging the scythe of death, but Kadek knew that even a slight graze would be enough to finish him. The bow in his hand made Ed's movements clumsy and careless as he struggled against the coordinated attacks. Kadek realized Ed had failed to carefully observe his surroundings, a fatal mistake. As expected, Ed lost his footing on the muddy ground, revealing a fatal opening. Seizing the opportunity, Nox lunged with his blazing fist, roaring that Ed had nowhere left to run. Facing the final attack, Ed simply offered a confident smile and calmly replied, "I know." A dagger suddenly flew in, plunging into Nox's back with a sickening sound. The muscular knight let out one final scream of agony, fresh blood spilling from his mouth as he collapsed. Kadek froze, screaming his comrade's name in horror and struggling to understand what had just occurred. He wondered if it was telekinesis or some kind of spirit spell that had claimed Nox's life. Kadek realized in shock Ed's entire plan. He had only used basic shield magic to lure them both in close. All the while, Ed had secretly prepared another attack right before their eyes. With a subtle smile, Ed softly called his spirit's name, Mug. On command, the tiny fire spirit detonated, creating a massive fireball that blasted Kadek away. Amidst the sea of fire, Kadek roared in fury as he witnessed Nox fall. Suddenly, two razor-sharp ice spears pierced through the curtain of fire, hurtling straight toward him. Kadek couldn't react in time, struck by the two ice spears in his hip, causing him to stagger. He gritted his teeth in astonishment, unable to believe Ed could launch an accurate attack from the center of an explosion. When the smoke cleared, Ed emerged, breathing heavily but completely unharmed, thanks to the restoration blessing that granted him fire immunity. Kadek tightened his grip on his daggers, astonished by Ed's progress but still scoffing that he should have aimed for vital points. Confident in the finishing blow, Kadek roared that there would be no next time, simultaneously accumulating a savage surge of green energy. He unleashed his full power, creating a deadly energy vortex that rushed toward Ed. The destructive attack swept away everything in its path amidst the pouring rain. After the attack dissipated, Ed was seen coughing up blood. He had used Nox's body as a shield to protect his vital points. Kadek scorned Ed's actions, but still raised his weapon, declaring that this was truly the end. Suddenly, a massive blue spectral tiger appeared right behind Kadek, its roar drowning out the sound of the rain. Kadek was stunned, unable to believe what was unfolding before his eyes. He wondered if Ed had truly managed to summon another spirit. From a whirlpool beneath his feet, the mid-rank water spirit Licia materialized and lunged forward. Licia enveloped Kadek, submerging him in a sphere of water that made him scream in suffocation. Meanwhile, Nox, who seemed defeated, was using his hand to pull the magical dagger out of his back. Kotick struggled desperately, his mouth wide open but unable to draw breath. With an extraordinary effort, Nox gripped the dagger's hilt, determined to remove the weapon from his body. Ed was utterly astonished to see Nox standing tall over him, his eyes blazing red, and holding the dagger he had just pulled out. Despite being severely wounded, the Brown Bear Knight's battle experience allowed him to maintain consciousness. Nox's recovery was a development that even Ed Rothstaler could not have foreseen. The moment the dagger was completely pulled out of Nox's back was a truly unexpected event. While restrained by Leisha, Kotick suddenly sensed an even more terrifying threat approaching. Marilda appeared in the form of a giant spectral wolf, unleashing a tempest called the Protection of the Wind. The massive surge of wind energy struck Kotick directly, mercilessly throwing him far away. Kotick's body was blown far away by the irresistible force. Ed, covered in injuries, silently observed the rapidly changing situation. Nox, still clutching the blood-soaked dagger, stepped toward Ed, who was looking up. The muscular man stood tall, eerily silent before Ed and the spirit Leisha. Finally, Nox collapsed forward, falling onto Ed. Kotick lay motionless in the rain, his eyes rolled back, utterly defeated. Nox's eyes rolled back as he breathed his last breath under the pouring rain. Ed Rothstaler gasped for air, covered in blood, and utterly exhausted after the life-or-death battle. Kneeling on the ground, Nox looked up at Ed and begged for a quick death as a final mercy. Ed's eyes widened as he recognized his opponent's desperate plea. Grasping Nox's hand, Ed summoned a vibrant purple magic dagger and coldly replied that this was what he should be asking for. Ed bitterly admitted that his father was determined to eliminate him, and even if he won this fight, he would still die, so he might as well end things here. Hearing Ed's despair, Nox calmly stated that his death would not be meaningless, as it would at least free Nox from the shackles of hatred. With a cruel expression, Ed declared this a small gift for Nox's loyalty to the Rothstaler family. He decisively plunged the magic dagger into Nox's chest. Nox let out a final scream of agony as the blade pierced through his body. The pain from the wound and the extreme exertion caused Ed to cough up a mouthful of blood. Suddenly, Yennecar Palarover appeared from the edge of the forest, calling out worriedly to Ed and saying her class had ended earlier than expected. Her eyes immediately flashed with horrified red as she witnessed the bloody scene before her. The weight of Nox's collapsing body pushed Ed off balance, causing him to fall backward and tumble over the edge of the cliff. Ed only managed to cough up blood in shock as his body plummeted straight down into the abyss. Witnessing the unbelievable sight, Yennecar screamed and rushed toward the cliff edge in a panic. Ed fell into the endless darkness, his desperate hand reaching up into the air. Yennecar reached out, trying desperately to grab Ed's falling hand. She collapsed at the edge of the cliff, screaming his name in despair as she powerlessly watched him vanish. Yennecar stood frozen, with only the sound of the falling rain and the image of Ed dissolving into the deep darkness remaining. Nox staggered back to his feet in the rain, covered in blood and muttering curses. He was horrified to realize that a witness had seen everything, while his body was rapidly reaching its limit. Nox's eyes widened, reflecting an unbelievable sight unfolding before him. A gigantic purple summoning array suddenly appeared, leaving him stunned and wondering what it was. Even a battle-hardened Brown Bear Knight had never witnessed anything like it. This was an entity on a level higher than even a high-rank spirit. This array was the result of a genius elementalist, the right hand of Glaskin, who had poured her entire life force into it. In her extreme rage and sorrow, she had summoned a terrifying power. It was the sun that burns the earth, an entity whose tail was larger than the capital city itself. It was the one who scorched the Alphonse mountain range during the mythological era. The highest-rank fire spirit, Teorphis, merely summoning one of its hands would be enough to burn the entire northern forest to ashes. Nox didn't need to understand the meaning of the gigantic magic array in the sky, because when he saw what was approaching, he knew it meant absolute death. Yennecar stood in the eye of the energy storm, her eyes glowing red with hatred as she demanded if he understood what he had just done. Nox could only utter choking sounds, suffocated by an invisible pressure. He screamed in utter agony as the red dark energy began ripping his body apart. Suddenly, a powerful stream of green energy rushed in, enveloping him. A gigantic wolf spirit made of wind energy roared a single command: "Run!" Nox was completely confused by this sudden intervention, while the command echoed, "Hurry and run! You must survive." Marilda ordered Nox to report everything he had witnessed before a powerful gust of wind flung him away. From somewhere, the summoner wondered what Marilda was doing. In her fury, Yennecar roared, demanding the wolf spirit get out of her way. Marilda gently glided past, easily evading Yennecar's rampage. The wind spirit advised Yennecar to calm down and reconsider, as she couldn't even remember who it was. Marilda revealed a shocking truth. Yennecar was not the one who had summoned it. Below the cliff, the sea churned violently under the heavy rain. An injured hand belonging to Ed Rothstaler emerged from the cold water. In a flashback, Lortel had once asked Ed about the progress of his magic technique after he acquired some items. Ed recalled that his entire rest period had been spent training magic techniques all day long. Back in reality, he secretly affirmed that it had been a great success, because he had managed to craft a legendary grade magic item, the Hourglass of Delheim, which was now shattered after a single use. Ed staggered and dragged his battered body onto the shore, coughing violently. He told himself that he only managed to reverse time by a few seconds, enough to negate the injuries from the fall and neutralize the toxins, but his body temperature was dropping rapidly. He had summoned Marilda because the situation on the cliff was unstable, but now he was too exhausted to know if the plan had succeeded. Ed staggered forward, regretting having to use the Hourglass of Delheim, a treasure that shouldn't exist until Act 3, so prematurely. But then, a flash of determination sparked in his eyes as he asserted, "I survived." He shuddered, thinking of Kreppen Rothstaler's troublesome causality determination magic. Ed knew that even if he defeated Kadek and Nox to survive, Kreppen would still use his vast magical power to repeat that magic, until he found a new future where Ed had to die. Therefore, he needed to die once. Ed calculated that even if he didn't understand why Kreppen wanted to kill him, if Kreppen confirmed a future where Ed was dead, he would temporarily lose interest. He knew sending vassals to Arkan Island was complicated. The only logical reason was to support Tanya in the election or negotiate for the sealed tome. This meant that if he lived as a dead man until the negotiations and election concluded, he could survive. The problem was that his body couldn't move normally, and he suddenly realized something. His fire spirit, Mug, appeared from above, diving down through the rain. Ed struggled to sit up, admitting his body ached as if he were dying, but he felt relieved to have been found. Just as he was about to thank Mug, he was suddenly embraced by someone. Yennecar Palarover, overwhelmed with emotion, hugged Ed tightly. They both tumbled onto the damp ground. Yennecar trembled, lying atop Ed in the pouring rain. Ed apologetically murmured his regrets for always making Yennecar, worry. He gently placed a hand on her back to comfort her. Afterward, inside a dry cave, Yennecar explained that Ed needed to hide until the election was over. Outside the cave, the rain continued relentlessly. Yennecar said she would bring daily necessities and supplies. She smiled, telling Ed not to worry too much, and he thanked her. But he winced slightly because his wounds still throbbed from when she had hugged him. Yennecar quickly let go, flustered, and apologized for being too relieved when she embraced him. She turned away in embarrassment, curled up, and asked Ed to forget what she had just said. Ed silently looked outside, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and merely commented that it was still raining. Inside the damp cave, Ed and Yennecar sat quietly by the fire, even though there was still much work to be done outside. At the same time, at a simple wooden shack, the rain continued to fall relentlessly. Under the eaves, Lucy Mayriel sat huddled, not out of boredom, but practicing patience. She felt a sense of peace, easily visualizing the daily life of the shack's owner. In her mind, the image of Ed returning after patrolling the forest and checking the reinforced wooden stakes appeared vividly. She saw him carefully gathering the soaking wet clothes from the line and putting the metal tools away in a dry place. Although Ed's life was full of turmoil, he always returned here, brushing off the raindrops and smiling as he greeted her. She imagined him sitting at the table, lighting a lamp to read books on magical engineering, while she drifted off to sleep by the fireplace. It was a peaceful sleep, enveloped by the sound of the rain, the crackling fire, and the rustling pages of Ed's book. But then, the stillness was broken when Lucy suddenly opened her eyes, sensing a strange surge of mana and the faint scent of blood. The disturbance of her peace caused a flicker of annoyance. A memory flashed through her mind. The image of Ed thanking her for protecting the house. Lucy yawned, floating in the air within a purple magical aura. Her gaze suddenly froze as she spotted an uninvited guest. A muscular man with white hair, covered in injuries, was kneeling in her magical puddle, identifying himself as Nox, a Rothstaler vassal, and begging for help. With a panicked expression, Nox claimed he had stumbled and that his comrade had been attacked by wild beasts. However, a cold voice rang out, promising him life, and Nox's face was instantly filled with terror. Purple magic enveloped the surrounding forest. With glowing, menacing eyes and a smile, Lucy laid down a condition. If he was honest, he would live, then pressed him for his true objective. On the ground, a dagger emitted a purple light. It was the deadly poison seal. A patrolman recognized the glowing dagger as an extremely rare high-grade seal, silently lamenting his misfortune. Standing atop the cliff, he deduced that the seal had been used, the victim was dead, and had fallen into the abyss, making them very difficult to find. The patrolman summarized Yenikar's account. She had come to help Ed, but found that he had been stabbed. With a sorrowful expression, Yenikar confirmed the story was true. The patrolman asked further questions, and Yenikar asserted that the culprits were vassals of the Rothstaler family, named Kadek and Knox. Hearing the name Rothstaler, the patrolman was stunned, intending to report the incident to the senior dean the next morning. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he spotted a figure looming in the rain. The figure wearing a witch's hat startled the patrolman, who stammered, asking which student it was. Immediately, the figure vanished in the blink of an eye, and then Lucy Mayriel appeared right in front of them, filling Yenikar and the patrolman with extreme dread. Yenikar quickly tried to calm Lucy, promising to explain everything later and informing her that she had captured the assassins. She pointed to the unconscious Kadek and Knox, confirming they were the Rothstaler vassals. Lucy's hand trembled as she reached down, touching her staff on the ground. As she gripped the staff, violent torrents of purple magical lightning began to erupt. Yenikar screamed Lucy's name in desperation as she was engulfed by a vortex of dark energy. A massive purple magical explosion erupted, blowing away everything nearby. The patrolman was thrown back, shouting in shock that they had to pursue Lucy immediately. Yenikar, with a determined expression, urged her companions to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, Kadek and Knox were writhing in agony as they were brutally tortured by Lucy's magic. Looking down from above, Lucy coldly interrogated the two vassals about their loyalty to the Rothstaler family. Amidst the pouring rain, Lucy Mayriel, enveloped in an aura of dark magic, snarled the name Rothstaler. At her feet, Knox, his face smeared with blood, struggled to clarify that they were not intruders but were present to assist Tanya Rothstaler with the Academy's official permission. A fleeting image showed Tanya Rothstaler wearing a cold, indifferent expression. Hearing that name, Lucy's fury erupted violently, and she clenched her fist, which was blazing with magical energy. A terrifying explosion of dark magic rocked the very ground. Lucy hovered in midair, encased by a storm of deadly purple energy. Her eyes blazing with killing intent, she roared, demanding to know Tanya's whereabouts. From a distance, Yenikar screamed Lucy's name in terror. A group of robed Academy mages stood aghast, wondering what calamity was unfolding. One of them raised a magical artifact, a cube emitting a brilliant blue light. Blue magical circles spread across the space, attempting to suppress Lucy's overwhelming power. The leading female mage questioned Lucy's actions. Lucy responded only with an icy glare, completely disregarding them. She effortlessly crushed the magical artifact with her bare hand, causing it to shatter into fragments. The robed female mage could only stare in horror at the destruction of the relic. Hovering above them within the chaotic energy vortex, Lucy issued a chilling command. "Bring her to me." Her eyes flashed with cruelty as she explicitly named Tanya as her target. Meanwhile, in another location, a massive explosion rocked an academy building. Amidst the smoke and dust, one figure stood tall, while the other knelt, conceding it was a good fight. Tanya Rothstaler, the victor, snorted contemptuously, deeming her opponent arrogant merely for having defeated second-year seniors. Amidst the wreckage, Wade Collarmore praised Elvira but humbly admitted he couldn't yet claim to have defeated second-year students. Wade glanced toward the figure, still standing. Ziggs Eifelstein, the greatest remaining obstacle. Leaning against a pillar, Ziggs merely exhaled softly, completely unfazed by the scrutiny. From his vantage point, Ziggs silently assessed Wade, acknowledging that despite defeating the alchemy valedictorian Elvira, Wade was still the overall first-year valedictorian, a fact he found perplexing. Ziggs recognized his opponent as Wade Collarmore, heir to a prestigious swordsman lineage, and for the first time, he entertained the thought that Wade might actually defeat him. His thoughts were abruptly severed by a concussive sound. Both Wade and Ziggs spun around sharply, while other students panicked, questioning if this was yet another attack. Instantly, a colossal purple magical explosion submerged the entire area in an eerie light. Amidst the chaos, the sound of someone's footsteps echoed. Ziggs rushed off, intending to find the headmaid for a situation report, but then he abruptly froze. He realized that given this level of magic, it was already too late. The scene before him was a nightmare. Countless staff and maids frozen in place, helpless within shimmering bands of purple energy. High-level time magic, the temporal prison, had been activated, confining everyone within an eternal moment. High above, Lucy Mayriel hovered within a colossal magical vortex, wielding a spell that others would spend a lifetime attempting to master. In a bone-chilling voice, Lucy commanded, "Bring Tanya Rothstaler to me." Ziggs recognized the terrifying source of power with horror, stammering Lucy Mayriel's name. A maid who had fortunately escaped waved desperately, urging everyone to evacuate immediately. When Ziggs and Wade arrived, another maid collapsed to her knees, reporting in panic that even the head maid had fallen victim. The maid continued with an even more horrifying truth. If Lucy's words were accurate, then third-year student Ed Rothstelor was dead. The shocking news momentarily stunned Ziggs, but he then decisively stepped forward, charging toward the eye of the storm. Wade Callermore was aghast when the maid revealed the assassin was a Rothstaler vassal, immediately leading him to suspect Tanya Rothstaler's involvement. He turned to the maid, his expression filled with confusion and disbelief. Amidst the turmoil, Ziggs Eifelstein coldly ordered everyone to proceed without him. Wade angrily yelled at Ziggs, demanding to know why he was seeking revenge instead of evacuating. Ziggs glanced back, offered an apology, and asserted that he would leave later, when the opportunity arose. Immediately afterward, the door leading into a room slammed shut with finality. Without hesitation, Ziggs used his power to shatter the sturdy wooden door. His eyes flashed with resolve, as if he had confirmed a suspicion. Ziggs stepped into the ruined room, recalling that Tanya had not been seen since the initial explosion, and this door had been locked from the inside. He quickly pinpointed the only possible hiding spot in the room. Inside the large chest, Tanya was trembling with fear, sobbing and wondering why things had devolved into this state. Ziggs looked at the girl with a complex expression, thinking that all the evidence was stacked against Tanya, yet he still couldn't comprehend it. He recalled that thanks to Ed, Tanya's reputation and life at the academy had vastly improved. Thus, even if she harbored ill will toward her brother, orchestrating an assassination seemed utterly illogical. Ziggs remained silent for a moment, weighing the contradictions in his mind. Then he spoke in a serious tone, demanding that Tanya answer him truthfully. His eyes blazing with intensity, Ziggs growled the direct question. "Did you order Ed's assassination?" Tanya burst into desperate sobs, utterly terrified, and swore she was innocent. Ziggs looked at the cowering girl, realizing he couldn't be certain of the truth. But if things continued this way, Tanya would surely die by Lucy's hand. Thinking of Ed's death, Ziggs felt an encompassing void, yet too many confusing events were unfolding. He clenched his fist, deciding that while non-intervention might be the logical choice, he could not simply stand by and watch. Ziggs sternly ordered Tanya to stay put, promising to hear the details later. He looked at the trembling girl and judged that, if Tanya stepped out into the plaza, death would be unavoidable. In Ziggs' mind, the image of Luce's hair ribbon floated amidst a stream of blue magical power, symbolizing the prospect of her having to shed blood. Shrouded in an aura of determination, Ziggs declared that he would stop Lucy, believing this was not what Ed desired. Wade Callermore suddenly spoke up, coldly questioning Ziggs about his apparent unawareness of the dangerous situation. Suddenly, a warrior clad in full red armor appeared, declaring that they would use force to take Tanya away. A blazing magical arrow was fired from a bow of light, soaring toward the plaza. The arrow aimed directly at Lucy, who was hovering in midair within her own vortex of magic. A terrifying explosion engulfed the plaza in a sea of fire. The destructive power of the attack was tremendous. Under the heavy downpour, the white-haired cat warrior lay motionless on the ground, her body completely petrified. Clevius Nortondale screamed in horror upon witnessing a fellow student being petrified right before his eyes. The face of the petrified warrior looked strangely serene, as if she were smiling. In his shock, Clevius recalled Dorothy, the third-year top student of the alchemy faculty. He panicked intensely, mistakenly believing the victim was Dorothy, and couldn't believe even a top student had been defeated. Clevius's desperate gaze turned toward the sky, where Lucy still hovered like an enraged deity. Lucy, concealed beneath the brim of her witch's hat, radiated a terrifying, unshakable purple magical aura. Overwhelmed by terror at that power, Clevius let out a cry and turned to flee for his life. He ran while screaming in despair, cursing the fate that had thrust him into this chaotic situation. In his panic, Clevius slipped and fell, sprawling into a puddle of rainwater. He scrambled back up and continued his desperate flight from the plaza amidst the torrential rain. Clevius fell backward into the cold rainwater puddle. Lying motionless in the rain, he thought fearfully of the terrifying power he had just witnessed and cursed his own helplessness. A voice suddenly rang out, scolding Clevius for being an idiot for just lying there. Looking up, he saw Elvira Aniston standing over him. She explained that she had just used up all her reagents and was heading to the laboratory. Elvira assessed that currently, only the top students had the capability to stop the monster, Lucy Mayriel. She calculated that they needed to hold out for at least 30 minutes before the academy staff arrived. Seeing that Clevius had lost all will to fight, Elvira told him to run to the faculty building as soon as possible and call for help. With that, Elvira turned away, looking up at Lucy's massive magical power in the sky with a determined expression. Clevius stared blankly at her retreating back. He lowered his head, letting the heavy raindrops fall upon him. Clenching his fists, Clevius tormented himself, calling himself foolish and pathetic. He gritted his teeth, hating himself for his utter uselessness. The rain continued relentlessly, washing over the desolate plaza. In a hidden cave, Yennecar anxiously reported the situation to the recuperating